G'day, mate. 40 here. Have you heard the expression, the dog that didn't bark? It's an excellent tool for understanding the world around us, and it comes from a detective story. And detective stories work usually through abductive logic. So one way of understanding deductive reasoning, it's not precise, but it's approximate. It's from the general principles to specific examples, and inductive is from the specific to the general. And abductive is your reasoning to the best explanation. And so when you read a detective story or you're watching a movie or a TV show where you're trying to figure out what's going on, right, you usually will be operating with abductive reasoning. What's the best explanation for what's going on? And so there's an 1892 book, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's just a collection of short stories. One of the stories is Silver Blaze. It's a mystery about the disappearance of a famous racehorse the night before a race, and then the murder of that horse's trainer. And Sherlock Holmes, the lead character, recognizes what's going on because the dog didn't bark. That the dog did not bark when you would have expected it to do so while a horse was being stolen led Sherlock Holmes to the conclusion that the evildoer was not a stranger to the dog. And so too with what's going on in California, particularly in Southern California with regard to the fires. What's remarkable is that I'm not hearing people in the elite defending Karen Bass. I'm not hearing people in the elite defending Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, defending Gavin Newsom. And so it's just striking that the mainstream news media, which is generally extra reluctant to criticize politicians on the left who are black or Latino, are giving Karen Bass some additional scrutiny and some critical coverage that you would not normally expect. So the dog that did not bark is the lack of defense among elites for California governance, and it seems to reflect an increasingly widespread realization by non-conservatives, non-Republicans, that liberal governance in many of our biggest states and biggest cities is simply a failure. And LA's inept response to these fires just symbolizes this overall failure of liberal governance in many of our biggest cities and biggest states. So the All In podcast, I'm not an unabashed fan. Sometimes they've got some good insights, and there were some good moments in their most recent issue. The All In podcast is a collection of billionaires talking about the news.
Read, Marc?
Yeah, very close.
How did you guys reconcile your differences in political views in this last election? Because he was very vocal. Kamala, you obviously became vocal Trump, and very kind of diametrically different views on.
So Reed here is Reid Hoffman, who in 2015, 2016 was ready to go scorched earth on anyone who supported Donald Trump. But this time around, Reid Hoffman didn't want to blow up those relationships. So Reid Hoffman, very much a liberal left-wing donor, but this time around, he wasn't quite ready to blow up his friendships over support for Donald Trump.
The future.
Well, it's interesting because Reid and I really started the whole kind of journey into bigger national politics together. We both sat down and had lunch with Biden and wrote big checks a little over a year ago, December of 23. And then, won't bother you, but I had my red pill moment and I went a very different direction, which started off just questioning the Democrats.
Hold on. Can you actually just double click into that? What was your red pill moment? Was there one specific thing, or was it more of a trickle of things?
It was both, right? It's like the wall starts crumbling and then it comes down all at once. So for me, it really started early in 23. I started reading Pirate Wires and Mike Solana, and I thought he was a little crazy at first because he would write these articles. One he wrote was about how the Ukrainian soldiers had swastikas on their helmets, and the New York Times photographers would ask them to take the swastikas off for photos. And I said, that can't be right. That can't be true. And then 4 months later, it was in the New York Times, buried in the middle of the paper. And I kept seeing stories like that he would be early on. And so I just started feeling uncomfortable and queasy about what was going on with mainstream media. And then in May of last year of 24, I read some article that talked about Trump's speech in Charlottesville. And this has been well covered, but where he said there was good people on both sides. And the article said it was completely, propaganda and not accurately reflecting what he said, that he denounced the Nazis a bunch of times in his speech. And so then I went and watched that video, and that was my red pill moment. I think it was for a lot of people, because it wasn't just the media spinning it or politicians spinning it. That was like one of the pillars of why you were supposed to hate Trump, was that speech. And then you see Biden say that's why he had to run a second time. And you see Obama you even see Biden bring it up again in the beginning of the DNC. And it's one of their pillars, and they clearly know that they're misrepresenting things. So for me, that was beyond uncomfortable. I was just like, okay, now I got to go back to first principles and look at the primary data and listen only to original speeches by people. And I just realized I couldn't trust mainstream media. So I started questioning the Democrats. As soon as I started questioning the Democrats, I started getting a lot of shame and anger and hatred. Oh, the other thing that happened that was part of this journey is that my chief of staff parted ways with me after 9 years in April of last year. And he was the main person protecting me from myself on Twitter. And he was the one who would say, stay in your lane. Nobody wants to hear what you think about politics or San Francisco or anything other than I started your area of products and investing. And with him gone, I just started tweeting whatever I felt and thought. And sometimes I got it wrong or it was a little too emotional. But first of all, it was really fun. And then second of all, I found I got connected to this whole new audience of people who are these kind of techno optimists. I think you guys probably talked about it. And that just brought me down this path that eventually I came out 2 days before the election publicly for Trump.
So not much support for Karen Bass in Los Angeles right now, not much support for Gavin Newsom. There is a great deal of support for the Los Angeles Fire Department captain, but also growing criticism. And one large reason for the criticism for our captain of the Los Angeles Fire Department is that the lack of deployment. When you knew that you're about to get the most severe and dangerous Santa Ana winds since 2011. So amid dangerous winds in 2011, LA Fire Department engines stood ready. That did not happen this time. So 13 years ago, Los Angeles Fire Department officials were bracing for the kind of dangerous winds that could drive flames across hillsides and canyons and tear through neighborhoods from Malibu to the Pacific Palisades to the San Fernando Valley. So back in 2011, the National Weather Service issued red flag warnings of doomsday gusts as fierce as 90 miles an hour. Forecasters described the coming windstorm as a once every 5 to 10 years calamity. And so then the Los Angeles Fire Department marshaled its defenses in the days before the arrival of these winds, taking the type of dramatic measures that the department failed to employ last week in advance of the Palisades fire, which followed wind alerts that said that these winds would be at least as bad, if not worse, than what we experienced in November of 2011. So we knew we were going to get gusts of 100 miles an hour, right? We knew we were going to get the worst Santa Ana winds, and we knew that we had about the driest rainy season ever. And so we did not have extra fire engines in place. All right, we did not have extra firefighters in place this time around. It seemed like a grave dereliction of duty.
It was only because that's when I completely got there. And I was trying to just be completely honest and authentic with myself and on Twitter at the same time. And my daughters turned to me that Sunday and they said, you're going to vote for Trump. We know it. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. And they said, well, then you have to go say it on Twitter. And my daughters were like really in this with me. Yeah. So anyway, and then it was on the front page of the New York Post on the day of the election that I was not that I'm such news, but maybe it was their news peg. That I was coming out for Trump. But I'll get back to your read question. But what I love about my New York Times, about my New York friends is that they did not give a f***. They were all pro Kamala and they texted me and they're just like, oh, that's kind of funny. But it's one thing I kind of.
So there was much more interest in destroying friendships and destroying relations with family members over Donald Trump between 2015 and 2023, but by 2024, I think there's been increasing reluctance to just blow up friendships over Trump. All right, he's much more socially acceptable this time around. So I primarily read the mainstream media rather than the right-wing media, and I recognize that the mainstream media is about 10 to 1 dominated by liberals and lefties compared to conservatives. And I recognize that this produces a distorted view of reality, But overall, I find that the mainstream media, with examples such as the New York Times, tends to offer more quality and more reliable reporting than the right-wing media. And if I hear some right-wing narrative that's outside of an area of my expertise, I don't trust it until I read mainstream media critiques of those right-wing narratives. Then I add up both, and I try to figure out what makes the most sense, and I do that based on my own life experience, my own knowledge, and when the elite narrative differs dramatically from my narrative, I try to figure out why. And so, for example, the elite denial that different groups have different gifts, right? That is clearly not based in fact. That's based completely in ideology, not in reality. And so then I have a ready explanation for why it's the elite narrative doesn't make sense. But what strikes me about the news coverage of these fires is in the LA Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, there's not much defense of Mayor Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom. And I recognize that much of the right-wing critiques, you can dismiss them as petty and partisan and not on point, right? There are all sorts of problems with the right-wing critiques, but there's not much interest in the mainstream media in defending liberal governance in California among non-conservatives, right? There is a growing realization that liberal governance has failed in Los Angeles, failed in many of our bigger cities. And even if people aren't on board with electing Republicans, right, there's recognition that something has gone wrong. So here's a good summary of the conservative critique. And this comes from an amazingly fair-minded essay in The New Yorker, which is a left-wing publication. But this is J. Caspian Kang, and he's a pretty fair-minded centrist writer. And so he sums up the right-wing critiques. The gay woman fire chief has the words DEI in her online biography. She's clearly did not hire qualified people. She is a liberal diversity hire. Now, the LA Fire Department chief has done every single job in the fire department, so she brings some considerable credentials to her task. She's not just a worthless hire. Liberal fealty to environmentalists who wanted to protect a tiny fish called the Delta smelt led to a water shortage in Los Angeles. Also, why does Ukraine have fully prepared fire stations on the United States dime and our firefighters are understaffed? Why are we spending money to protect illegal immigrants when that money could be used to prevent those fires? And another conservative critique is in January, the California legislature spent $50 million and legislative time Trump-proofing California when they could have instead used that time and that money to provide higher quality government services, including protection against fire and these type of natural disasters. So here we've got the New Yorker, January 16, J. Caspian King writing, I do wonder whether Californians, especially those in cities with crime rates that spiked during the epidemic, right? And liberals, people on the left, don't like crime. We've got poorly maintained infrastructure. We've got huge homeless populations, whether they might be questioning the priorities of the liberals who govern them. So I recognize that in purely logical terms, it is not inevitable that institutions that give considerable lip service to diversity, equity, and inclusion and other left-wing causes that, to me, as someone on the right, regard as silly, it's not axiomatic that just because they give lip service to some left-wing cause that they therefore produce lower levels of effectiveness and efficiency and excellence. But it just seems to always work out that way. Whenever I learn about an institution that puts a great priority on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it always seems to be accompanied, every example of which I'm aware, it seems to be accompanied by lower quality service. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is overwhelmingly left-wing, voters in both Oakland and San Francisco deposed their mayors in last November's election. Right, the mayor of Oakland was recorded in the midst of a bizarre corruption scandal. London Breed, right, who seemed to be on her way up in the Democratic Party, was defeated by Daniel Lurie, someone with no political experience. In Berkeley, 2 longstanding city council members running for mayor were defeated by an unknown challenger who is unknown to many voters. Now, it's difficult to believe that Californians, by and large, will leave the Democratic Party. But there is a general unease about the competence of Los Angeles, like many states, has tried to legislate away the free market and tried to require insurers to offer home insurance plans at a below free market price. But there is a cost to doing that, and you've got a considerable reduction in home insurance policies. Normally, right, insurance policies will signal to you the danger, the price, the expense of a particular opportunity. So when I was 19, I wanted to buy a Corvette. I had the intoxicating experience of driving a Corvette. And it's like, my God, I want a Corvette. I could afford a Corvette. And then when I saw how much auto insurance would cost for me, even the most bare bones auto insurance for me to drive a Corvette, I reckon, no, I'm not getting a Corvette. And California referenda and legislation prevents the true price of home insurance in the most dangerous areas flowing through to people who want to purchase it. And you just can't legislate away the free market without suffering severe consequences. So it is reasonable for people in Los Angeles to be skeptical that this government agency, FAIR, will pay out. And it's reasonable to be skeptical that the whole claims process will not be so broken, so bureaucratic, and so ultimately bankrupt that it would be almost easier just to skip it. And there is a significant portion of the California electorate who will never vote Republican, certainly not in a presidential election, who are on the left in cultural issues, when it comes to race and gender and sex issues, who can't figure out why a place such as California with such wealth and such high taxes cannot seem to run efficiently on a local level. And even people on the left have enormous grievances about the effectiveness and efficiency of California government. Right, we've got all these homeless encampments in California cities. We've got overzealous equity pushes in public schools. We've got bad roads. We've got high taxes. We've got property crime. And we're supposed to accept it, just part of the deal if you want to live in California. Now, catastrophic events like the fires in LA have a way of turning these annoyances into disillusionment. And we've got an entire army of right-wing online warriors who stepped up the attacks on Gavin, Newsom, and Mayor Karen Bass. And this New Yorker writer says, I have been struck by how little resistance these right-wing attacks have encountered, whether from elected Democrats, media figures, or even liberal posters. Right? When the fires come, right, how many of us will feel the narrative pull to turn all our separate grievances about shoddy liberal governance with regard to potholes or public schools or petty corruption into one grand story of failing liberal leadership? And I think that's the big picture on these LA fires. It is pushing more and more people into buying into an overarching grand narrative about failing liberal governance. And I'm not someone who expects that Republican governance will automatically be superior. I don't like the Ronald Reagan free market Republican attitude that government is always the problem. I recognize that there is a role for the government to play, if not as a nanny state, but incentivizing good behavior, disincentivizing bad behavior, offering some protection to people against their own worst instinct, say some protection against the lures of pornography and gambling, right? I am fine with some kind of legislation that blocks access to pornography unless you specially sign up somewhere proving that you're an adult. I would like to see legislation that prevents children or the unwary immediately being confronted by pornography. I would be okay with government restrictions on promoting horrible food to children through advertising. I would be fine with a ban on advertising for alcohol, and maybe a ban on advertising for the most devastating to health foods such as Coca-Cola or highly sugary breakfast cereals. So I am open to the government intervening in the free market. Right? I recognize that the free market's not perfect. I recognize that there's no one narrative that is sufficient to life, not the Adam Smith free market narrative, not the narratives available within Orthodox Judaism, not any particular right-wing nationalist narrative. And the world is so complicated that we need increasingly sophisticated and varied narratives about how we work and how the world outside of us works.
I love about New York. They didn't care. Back to your question on Reed. What I love about Reed was he was already getting pings from people saying, what's going on with Pincus? He's going off the rails. He's becoming a Trumper. You know, it's you guys, I'm sure, have gone down
I got
this
a little
road.
bit of that too about Shemaz and Greenberg.
Yeah.
Me.
So you're like, what's wrong with him? We got to bring him back into the fold. You know, he's, should we lock him up? Is he crazy? And so Reed was already getting these. I had a lot of anxiety about talking to Reed about it. And finally, Reed and I got on FaceTime and he just said, I just want to start by saying I'm Team Marc. And I said, I'm Team Reed. And it gets out a little, you know, but
well, no, Americans can get along even if they disagree politically about candidates. Probably where we need to get to, especially, you know, now that Trump's going to be in office in a couple of days. What was it like when you had lunch with Biden? Yeah.
Okay. Well, just to finish the Reed part. Sorry.
Sure.
But
no problem.
What I love about Reed is that we followed that with a 4-hour dinner. And he said, I never questioned your principles. He said, I know you're a highly principled person. And I just want to understand which principles it is. And I'd like to convince you to change your mind. But anyway, so Reed was the
hold
best.
on one second. So
Okay, TikTok is back in the United States. I don't know if this is good news or bad news. I certainly support the legislation banning TikTok unless they sell it to an American company, and that TikTok was ready to shut down its service to the U.S. rather than sell it to an American indicates that it was primarily a spying operation by the Chinese government. But you'll be glad to see that my TikTok is back. And do you think Jerry Springer really wanted to be known for creating trash TV shows? No, he didn't. He's actually a thoughtful, intelligent guy. But he got captured by the success that he achieved turning out trash. And so he gravitated towards that realm that gave him applause and that gave him money and gave him status. And getting applause is incredibly intoxicating, right? If you have it live stream in front of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people at once who are positively responding to what you have to say, it is an unbelievable rush. People who gaslight you, who deny their own manipulative behavior, who ignore the evidence when you present it to them, who are dismissive and critical if you disprove their fabrications, who never address their inappropriate behavior and said it's your fault for being overly sensitive. The problem isn't the abuse, it's your reaction to the abuse. People who... Right, it's not the gaslighting, it's why do you lack sufficient honesty with yourself that you're unable to recognize when other people are lying to you and manipulating you. If you are honest with you, right, then you will quickly catch on when other people are lying to you. Some biologists have taken great exception to the term invasive species because they know that it can then be used on immigrants and people. Because you can import immigrants who then outcompete the natives at various things. They may be more effective than the natives at, say, computer programming, or they may have particularly high verbal IQ. They may take over a country's culture, or they may be less scrupulous in getting welfare payments from and manipulating the system. They may import. You may import immigrants who have a dual morality. But let's imagine you're a country that's overwhelmingly dominated by a universalist morality outlook, meaning that it's not okay to treat outsiders any different than you treat insiders. So and so you can have societies that are created, developed, built by Northern Europeans who then import in people with a dual morality who think it's okay to treat outsiders with much less regard, with a much lower standard than you treat your own group. And so that's definitely a challenge.
On the other hand, what can happen is that you can import immigrants who believe and practice dual morality, okay, to treat outsiders their with children become assimilated at a lower standard than you treat your own group. And so
wait, what the hell?
That's definitely a challenge. On the other hand, what can happen is that you can import immigrants who...
Okay. What the hell? Got two windows playing on me at once. So what other great insights have I had to offer?
Conservative intellectuals say, oh, you shouldn't gossip. The great people talk about ideas, middle people talk about events, and lower class people talk about people. That's nonsense. Like, what kind of life can you have if you're not concerned about other people? Right? If you're concerned and interested in other people, you're going to talk about other people. Right? To not gossip is totally inhuman. We are wired to connect. We are wired to compare. We are wired for a desire for social status. We are wired for a desire for a loving physical relationship. And to try to turn off these natural passions, I think is inhuman, and I don't think it's helpful. Conservative.
Right. We can't help but compare ourselves to other people. We need to do that for connection, for information, right? Or other people are employing strategies that we should employ. We need to do it to recognize the strength or lack thereof of our relationships. But you can compare yourself to other people in a way that's adaptive or maladaptive. Obviously, if you go into some deep downward spiral, if you're consumed by envy and self-loathing, then there's something wrong with the mechanism by which you're comparing yourself to others. So Elliott Blatt says, table sugar was once considered a drug and kept in the medicine cabinet. It fuels mental disease. I don't know if that is true. I do know that around third grade, I would eat table sugar by the spoonful until my father caught me doing it. I had such an addictive need for sugar that I would, even though my dad was in his study, and if he looked up, I would be in his eye line as I went into the food cabinet eating sugar by the spoonful. I had such a need to do it that I was out there, and then I got caught, and I got busted, and I got punished. So, yeah, TikTok, in agreement with our service providers, TikTok is in the process of restoring service. We thank President Trump for providing necessary clarity and assurance to our service providers. And, yeah, my dad busted me. I got a severe punishment for eating sugar. And I think the same sort of addiction drove me to be watching some variety of Debbie Does Dallas in the living room while my father was in the kitchen next door. There was no closed door between us. And I was using this Debbie Does Dallas movie, and my father was just like right there, but my addictive need for pornography just completely outweighed my sense of self. Luckily, he did not walk in on me. I remember I was staying with this bloke in the United Kingdom. He was a fan of my blog, and so he paid for me to fly out to the United Kingdom. And it's my fault that I didn't knock, but I walked in on him like 3 times in 24 hours when he was having a wank. And that can really put a strain on a friendship. You really don't want to see your friend having a wank. It was also the first time that I'd ever seen anyone snort cocaine. And he lived in a bachelor apartment. It was quite filthy. It was near Parliament House, so lovely area. And who's the great playwright who Steve Saylor writes about, who lives in England? Tom Stoppard. I think Tom Stoppard lived in the same apartment complex. But this apartment was now a bachelor pad. It was pretty gross. And my friend had to clean off a little portion of the table so that he could snort his cocaine before we went out that night. Yeah, bro flew me to the UK because he liked my blog. But that's where my blog was a big deal. So this is back in 2005, 2006. And I spent a day at Cambridge University. I spent a day walking around Oxford University. I went to Paris for 24 hours, took the train under the English Channel. I spent Shabbat in the north of London in the Jewish neighborhood there. So I thought that if I become famous and a great writer, that not only will I be more likely to find people who have solutions for my chronic fatigue syndrome, I'll also be flown around the world by people who want to meet me or hear from me or just press the flesh. And so I got to spend a week in Montreal, Canada. The Canadian Broadcasting Company paid for that. Other people flew me to the Tampa show in Tampa, Florida for a few days. So I got flown around a little bit back in the days when my blog was really kicking it. Back in those days, glory days, when I'd have 10,000 viewers a day. Right, but that required a lot more effort than I put in these days on my blog. So less effort, less reward. What the hell? Where is? Here we go.
You said something almost in passing, but I just want to double click. I think part of what Silicon Valley actually gets wrong is that we don't embrace the tism. And what I mean by that is everybody, we're all a little socially uncomfortable. We're awkward. I wouldn't say that we were the coolest people growing up. And there's this virulent form of blockers. You called it chief of staff.
I remember I did this debate series in the LA Times about blogs versus mainstream journalism after I'd broken the story. This was in 2007, after I'd broken the story that Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa hadn't been wearing his wedding ring in public for about 8 months. It appeared his marriage was over. It turned into the biggest news story in California in 2007. It turned out he was having an affair with a Spanish language dialogue with Eric Spillman, I think, a reporter for KTLA Channel 5 in Los Angeles, blogs versus mainstream media. And I think it was arranged by Tim Cavanaugh, who went on to be the online editor at Reason Magazine. So back then, I think Matt Welch was in the LA Times opinion section. And when I was submitted my piece one day, I referred to the mayor as a coxman or some phrase like that. And they told me, look, you can't use that language in the LA Times. I had to remember what it was like writing for editors. So many advantages to writing for yourself, just no barrier between you and the public, but also many disadvantages. You don't write at your best. Often you're not as logical, not as clean and clear. You don't make as strong a case as you could if you had an editor, a good editor, who is prompting you to do better work.
I think that these folks can be very detrimental, which almost represent this filter between your true self and everybody else. And there is this game that's played about being a gatekeeper. I do think that executive assistants are valuable, administrative assistants are valuable. The reason I can say this is that my EA went on maternity leave. I experimented with the chief of staff, etc. And now I use Jason's service called Athena. And I have a guy that works with me in the Philippines, and it's about $3,000 a month. And I can honestly tell you, this guy is the single most.
So remember when John Edwards was running for vice president, and it was obvious that he'd been having an affair with this attractive female videographer, and he was cheating on his cancer-ridden wife, Saint Elizabeth, as she was known among his aides. And it was only the National Enquirer and bloggers who were pursuing the story that John Edwards had obviously been cheating on his wife. And so tabloid journalism received some considerable mainstream respectability in those years around 2004. And so one evening, I went out to drinks with a bunch of tabloid journalists. And whenever I wanted to discuss the philosophical implications of this or that story, nobody had any time for that. And when you recognize contributions from tabloid journalism, it's very tempting to be adversarial to the dominant narrative and say, oh, tabloid journalism does this good thing and that good thing, which is true. But also much of it's really gross and invasive and nasty. And tabloid journalists will trash someone's home just to try to get a rise out of them, will ask rude, nasty, shocking questions just to get a rise out of them, will invade the lives of celebrities that most people would find inappropriate, and would glory in getting, inadvertent snatch shots or nipple slips, just glory in getting photos of people that they would not have liked to have gone public. And when I was just at at drinks with these tabloid journalists. I was like, no, this is not my crowd. This is not my genre. I recognize that sometimes tabloid journalism does important work, but just like the porn industry, I'm willing to visit here. I'm willing to comment on it. I don't want to live here. I don't want to socialize here. These are not my people.
Effective administrative support I've ever had. And what there isn't is all these opinions on what I can say or do. And I think that when you look at a lot of these big companies, if you look at Zuck's current transformation or what you...
I have found when I work with someone who's interested in my opinion, that unleashes a tremendous amount of energy. And when I've worked for people who make it clear they do not want to hear my opinion, that forces a self-discipline and a reflection on my part that is also valuable. It's not as fun, and it's a little bit humiliating, but it forces me just to listen and to attune myself to what the boss wants. So I've learned a great deal working from highly skilled, very intelligent bosses who made it clear to me that they did not want my opinion. On the other hand, those bosses who did show some openness to my opinion, that was fun, and that unleashed energy. So I experienced considerable benefits from both style of employers.
You just spoke about. There are all these interlopers that seem to get in the middle of you and people's perception of you. I don't know if you have any comments or reactions to that idea.
Yeah. Well, many of these Silicon billionaires who become much more raw on social media made total asses of themselves. Dan Ackman just made total ass of himself. Who's the guy who's now Donald Trump's AI chief who's on this podcast? All right. He's David Sachs has also frequently made a complete ass of himself online. So sometimes when people block you from doing the things you naturally want to do, they really are doing you a favor.
Yeah, it's part of where I know you guys have talked about Zuck coming out as at least his based or his seemingly more authentic self or sharing more about himself. And I can relate to it because I think
Mark Zuckerberg, how is Mark Zuckerberg like the universe? Right. Mark Zuckerberg and the universe are neither with you nor against you. They are but raw material in your hands. Right. Mark Zuckerberg and the universe can be heaven and hell according to what you make of them. Right. Mark Zuckerberg and other big tech billionaires are going to ride the winds of social change. They are going to do what's best for themselves and for their company. And sometimes their interests and your interests are going to align. So it's more useful to understand the situationist perspective on life. Recognize that there are situations where the incentives underlying your behavior and someone else's behavior are going to be aligned. And then with the same persons in different situations, their interests and your interests are going to be contradictory. And I developed that rant about Mark Zuckerberg and the universe from a few lines from Will Durant and his history of philosophy. So Will Durant, by the way, he was 28 when he met his future wife. She was 14. And they quickly fell in love and stayed together forever. And she was also forever resentful that he got more credit than she did. And so he acquiesced to her request to include her name on some of the volumes of his history of philosophy. Back when I was working landscaping from age 19 to 22, I would dictate many of the things that I read onto cassette tapes, and then I listened to these cassette tapes while I was working. And I would read out onto these tapes and record large sections of Will Durant's history of philosophy.
We all go through this struggle as you start to be more of a known person inside your company, outside your company, and you have people around.
Sometimes it's good to be more known. Sometimes it is not good to be more known. Right? It's not like it's some inevitable thing that the better people get to know you, the better they'll like you. Right? It's just as likely the more people get to know you, the less they will like you. Right? And if you overshare, if you have a history of oversharing, it comes from a place of neediness. And I say that because I have a history of oversharing. And if you recall from the show about a year ago, 18 months ago, I was wondering out loud, why do so many people in my life treat me with disrespect? And then I realized it's because I am oversharing, which is a sign of neediness, and don't share things that you would not be comfortable with people gossiping about. I was oversharing. I was wearing my heart on my sleeves. I was being needy. I was trying to manipulate people by fast tracking intimacy. And one of the results of my misguided strategy was that people were treating me with contempt.
You taking the edges off. And I think that we're now in this time, I think authenticity is having a moment now, which is great for me because Reed said to me, if you Google me, you'll see that there's lots and lots of bad things written about me. And a lot of it is my high school quote was, some people have tact and others tell the truth. And I've always been kind of just committed to being honest, even if it's nuanced and it's not an easy soundbite. And Reed said to me early on, you need to pick one.
So there's some wisdom in the book of Proverbs, and one proverb that I treasure is, do not reprove the fool, for he will hate you. But if you reprove the wise man, he will love you for it. So don't reprove fools. It's simply not worth the blowback. If someone's not going to listen to you, don't waste the breath. That's why when you get painful feedback, when you get critical feedback, recognize that 20 other people would have given you the same type of feedback, only they didn't want to waste the energy. They didn't want to make themselves vulnerable, or they thought you were too foolish to be able to hear it. So if someone gives you valuable, critical feedback, recognize that probably 20 other people had the same thing in their head. They just weren't going to go to the bother of sharing it with you.
What the easy narrative is, or the press is going to make it up for you. And he was right. And they did, or my competitors did. So I think that now,
okay,
with
let's get
long-form
the
podcast,
Kipster back to the show. Kip, what's going on, man?
You don't know Luke from the wind. You never will. You never did. He's the little Jew who flouts the Bible. He's seen the nations rise and fall. He's met the porn stars, tasted them all. But filth and love, his only engine of survival. Your servant here, Kip, has been told to say it clear and say it cold. It's over. Things ain't going any further. And now the wheels of heaven have stopped. You feel the sting of Luke's riding crop. Get ready for the future. Luke wants murder. Things are gonna slide in all direction. Won't be nothing you can measure anymore. The blizzard of the world has crossed the threshold, and it's overturned the order of Luke's soul. When they said, repent, 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 Luke wondered what they meant. How you doing, Luke?
Good. Hey, have you felt socially obligated, or just felt like it was the reciprocal, righteous Christian thing to do, to reciprocate with oral sex? Performing oral sex?
Yeah. Reciprocate?
Yeah.
I guess so. Sometimes, but I got a very keen nose, so sometimes that nose causes some challenges, but I do the best I can. You know what I mean, Luke? I probably don't travel in as fine as circles as you all the time. You probably don't run across these things.
No, I have. But
you've ran across a barrier like that where you're like, this is just, we're going to have to come up with a plan B here.
Yeah, I kind of get why many women don't want to perform oral sex, because I don't like it. I don't like doing it. And I've often done it kind of out of a sense of obligation, but I'm not going to do it going forward. I just want the world to know that I am not going to deliver oral sex to a woman going forward.
Right. Well, you're like some sort of reverse vampire or slee stack, the way you don't have shows, I guess, between Friday night and Saturday night.
Yeah.
So we need to come up with some kind of a medal or something for Mr. Blatt, because you really screwed up. You gave him my information, or gave me his information or something. And, he does the Lord's work, and, and that means like probably therapy in the wee hours of the morning of just calming me down from a text. Would you like to hear one or two that I've sent him yesterday when you weren't available, when you
Yes,
decided
sir.
not to have a Saturday night show?
Yes, sir.
I figured this Elliott's just minding his own business. You know what I mean? I think he's quite the taskmaster. Whenever he's on your show, I always hear like keyboards going in the background and, just stuff happening. Things are happening around Elliott, so the last thing he needs is just me just dropping bombs on him right out of nowhere. So here it was. It just turned into Hiroshima. He got about 15, 20 texts last night before it was all over with, but it started out innocuous enough, I guess. In 2006, experienced car mechanics offered useful online tutorials for car repairs. Fast forward to 2025, and the hard nipples of a hard body gal taunting me while she's performing online car repairs very sexily. And then it got bold letters. That's really mean. I'm sort of getting delusional at this point. And it says, things get a little tougher for the average dude every day unless he gives in, jerks off, and leans into the degeneracy of globo homo. Man, don't you feel sorry for Elliott about this time? I mean, he's enjoying, some 5-star dinner somewhere in San Francisco, and he's getting bombarded with this craziness. What would you have written back at that point?
No fap, bro. No fap.
That would have been my short reply. I noticed when I bombard you with an email or two, your replies are usually like one sentence or so. So you've got that down to an art. And then of course, I start, answering questions in my own head going, should I care, Elliott? Homes cost $2,900 in 1940. It costs 300 to 400 times that in San Francisco now. Harvard was only $400 in 1947 when everybody came home from the war. Now it's all fake, gay, and expensive. Pisses me off, Elliott. Our own politicians rug pulled the American dream from us. And then, so you pretend to be Elliott. What am I getting from you at this point?
I probably wouldn't bother to reply. It's
okay.
like this is your mental addiction.
You're wanting to see if it's just a light level earthquake or if it's going to be some sort of a Mount St. Helens evening with Kip. But no, it kept going. And then right out of the blue, he hadn't said anything, right? And I'm thinking about inflation, so I expect him to read me like telepathy, and I fire up something like, transitory my ass. My own government has sold us out, homie. The term quadrillion will soon enter our lexicons. It's a big fuck you to savers. So I'll save you all the details, but let's just say there was about 15 or more, 20. But Elliott, he's he's playing chess with a checkers player. And he somewhere down the line, he said, I know how to get rid of this motherfucker. And he said, hey, there's an interesting chat going on online. And I fell for it, like a bass falling for a good lure or whatever. And I was away, and he was free for the night. And then maybe about 4 hours later, probably about midnight, I sent him back something like, thanks for that. That was a good, something to take my mind off of it or whatever. So even then he wasn't completely out of the woods. So yeah, he deserves a medal or something. Don't you think, Luke Ford?
Yeah, he's empathic. He's a good friend. He's This is a good community. Like you'll meet some great people on here.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that.
And then I had an additional thought that I don't know if you've met many great public speakers, but because I grew up going to church all the time, I would often encounter these just fantastic evangelists. And because I love eloquence, that I've had the privilege of knowing many highly charismatic rabbis and preachers and public intellectuals. And almost invariably, the more charismatic someone is on stage, the colder they are in person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any experience there.
Maybe not so much so. I haven't met that many famous people. I did meet Eric Wright, he was known as Eazy-E. He was a rapper. And he showed up at a mall, I guess, to try to get everybody hyped about a concert he was going to have like that night or the next night or whatever. And the largest mall in the whole state had just opened up like 6 or 7 months earlier, in a different part of town, you know. So it ended up just being me, him, and if you remember, he was a rapper turned actor named Ice-T. Sit there and had an orange Julius at the mall food court that nobody was at except us and the mall employees. So, but that's the only like famous persons I have met. And even then, you see, it's just like Trump's going to have an inauguration. Who's performing? Snoop Dogg. The goddamn culture.
Snoop Dogg is performing.
Yeah.
The
goddamn culture's going to the dogs, man. I mean, I was a part of it. You get what I'm saying? So if you hear shit on being about America being deracinated, I know it from the inside out. You know, maybe from a perspective that little Joey like you from down under wouldn't really understand. You know, it sounds. You might understand when I had told you before that I saw the flip side of the culture going from like a black school to a redneck school with the fishing lures in their ball caps and their guns in the back of their pickup trucks out in the student parking lot. Sounds like you saw that end of it, but you didn't get to see the glorious multi-culti side of it. You know, lucky you. So,
of course I have. We all have a choice of where we focus, right? I don't know if you've heard the anecdote. 2 men looked out from prison bars. One saw mud and the other saw stars, right? You can choose to focus on the mud or you can choose to focus on the stars. Like we have a whole library of different channels that we can tune into with our brain and with our consciousness. And we choose which channel we want to focus on. And there are channels of mud and dirt and everything disgusting and degenerate, or we can choose to focus on the channels of love and gratitude and wonder and awe. And so I prefer to tune into KGOD, right? I prefer to tune into the transcendent, the uplifting, the grateful, the awestruck channels. So those are the ones that I wish to spend most of my time in.
Yeah, I'm on the east of the Mississippi, so it's WGOD where I'm at. 10-4.
10-4.
I was gonna. One of the things that I had written down just was like just the state of white men, you know, in 2025, because it's kind of dawned on me. I started wondering, like, if my daughter and son-in-law or any young person asked me, where should the South is the place to go, but where should you go? I just started looking around, what's happened to see, like, what's the state of Nashville? What's the state of Charlotte or Raleigh or Chattanooga or Atlanta, and it is so much different than those towns were in the America that you and I were dropped into. I know you came in 1977, close enough, close enough. Most of those towns, most of the counties that those towns were in were like 85% white. And most of them now are like 60% white or less, so I got to thinking, okay, so that's just where we're at. Apparently we're down to like 55%. And I got to thinking about the original requirements for America was a white man with good character. Am I right, Luke? Wasn't that kind of like the original requirement?
One of the original immigration acts was
yeah. So I'm not being racist.
Character.
Yeah, that was an actual thing. And so I got to thinking, okay, so we're down to 55% of my kind. And then I got to thinking, well, how many passed the character test? Because I know only 23% of them that come out of high school are good enough to go to the military. And although that's not the character test, it's sort of a character test. Is that true or false? It's some sort of a measurement, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, so if we're down to 55% and only, let's say 25% of that's any good, oh my God, that puts us down to like somewhere between 12.5% and 13.5% of the stock You know what I mean? Of our ancestors. And I don't think when we're sitting here rapping, people don't realize that we came from, for the most part, this stock of what you might call like Calvinist people. They were so like into like the sense of community and godless and being full of God and good spirit and all that stuff that, like in Geneva, they weren't even allowed to have curtains, on their windows. And that's like, that's like their way. Like, I don't know if I told you, when I was in the Marines, we had ways of like doing checkups on one another. If somebody was getting ready to get in trouble from the drill instructor, it's a better thing that you smack them on the back of the head and get them to like snap out of whatever they're doing than let them be found out by the drill instructor, because we might all pay a price at that point. You get what I'm saying, Luke Ford? Okay.
Yeah, I get that you can only think about what we've lost.
Right. Well, no, but can you understand what I'm saying, that they took the 7 deadly sins seriously? They used to. The stock that we came from, they took that shit very seriously.
Well,
to the point to where they wanted Luke. They wanted Luke checking up on Kip checking up on Luke. They wanted Elliott making sure our sugar intake is okay. They wanted Glib keeping an eye on us. You get what I'm saying? That's what they wanted, to the point where you couldn't even have curtains on your over your windows in some of these towns.
And do you think there are any downsides to that level of intrusiveness and conformity?
Oh, I'm sure there are, Luke Ford, but now, Kip's always dreaming of 1955. And Luke, 1955 was just a moment in time and space. And it happened to be after most of Europe had been bombed out. You know what I'm saying? So economically, we cannot go back to 1955. You get where I'm saying there.
Right. And 1955 paved the way for 1965 and 75, right? You talk about how wonderful the 1950s were, but the 1950s created the 1960s. So everything that went wrong after the 1950s is in part due to what was going on in the 1950s.
Yeah, people didn't really start to lose their mind until I'd say 62, 63, 64.
Right, but that didn't emerge out of nothing. That emerged out of the 1950s. The 1950s prepared the ground for the collapse that you're describing.
Oh, I know, that fucking queer little Richard. I know exactly the things you're talking about. But, unlike you, I believe people are kind of gullible. And I don't believe all them people realized he was into boys, that old little Richard was into boys. So I think he was probably marketed as a sex symbol, wouldn't you think, Luke Ford? Or maybe the joke's on me. Maybe little Richard was the first of a long line of people that those promoters knew damn well what they were doing. They were selling records to little boys and little girls, thinking that he could be both of your girlfriends, boyfriends, what he can be, anything you want him to be, in much the same way. Wouldn't you say a Mick Jagger would be that way? Wouldn't you say a David Bowie would be that way? Wouldn't you say that maybe a Michael Jackson would be that way? And they just curated a whole line of these figures all the way down as we were just, became morally bankrupt. But yeah, so I know economically we can't go back, but I look at where we came from to where we've gotten to, and it just seems like, how do you we can't act like Lily Phillips has not happened, and the Kardashian culture, it hasn't happened. The genie is out of the bottle on this shit. The people of those Calvinist times, they would have been shocked a long time ago, Luke, when they burned those witches so many years ago.
Well, Calvinist countries, how do you explain that Calvinist Protestant countries were the countries first to go secular? That Protestant countries went secular far more in advance of Roman Catholic countries. So these cultures that you venerate, they were the quickest to go globo homo.
Yeah, when did that happen? Just incidentally. I mean, sounds like
it dramatically turned in the 1960s.
I got my own theories on that. I got my theories about, ethnically you're not a Jew, but when the waves of Jews, the first waves of Jews, they were flag toting. You remember the original Golden Hollywood type people? They were very patriotic. They wanted to show that they wanted to show everybody they deserved to be here and do their part or whatever. But I don't know. Let's just call them the next waves or whatever of not just Jews, Irish Americans, Italian Americans. I hate to say it, Luke. They're Irish and Catholic first. They were Italian and Catholic first. They're Jewish first. And this American thing, you can tell by the way they vote in blocks in all those towns. Or you can see the way those fucking Italians showed up in New York City. Where do they go? Where do they go? They never went to the heartland. You get what I'm saying? No. We gotta stay here where we can block everything up and game the system. Those are non-joiners, Luke. Give me some comment on that. I've just called.
Let me jump in. So,
okay,
much of the opposition and so-called prejudice against Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants is related to the behavior of those groups. And whenever you've had a Catholic-dominated city in the United States, it's also been characterized by enormous levels of corruption. But nowadays, virtually nobody would say that somebody of Irish descent or Italian descent or Jewish descent is constitutionally incapable of becoming a good citizen of the United States. But the initial opposition to those waves of immigration was in large part rational, empirical, and based on the behavior of various groups, right? The reason that many people hold anti-Jewish views has to do with behavior of Jews. The reason that many people hold anti-gay or anti-black or I'm getting feedback, so I don't know what you need to do to stop that. But the reason that people develop negative views about Jews is in large part a result of the antisocial behavior of those groups. Pass.
Mm-hmm. I can't see very well with my notes unless I have a lot of background light. So I held a flashlight close to the microphone. Would that cause that feedback you said you heard?
I don't know. It's,
you know what I mean? The same kind. It's the kind of flashlight that will have the batteries that a Tesla has in it. Those kind of rechargeable batteries. So I was just wondering.
Maybe it's the demonic aura inside of you and around you.
Yeah. My sister had went a little crazy in 2014. And at the time, I didn't realize she was off the wall crazy. But my mom had been giving me some feedback saying she was. So anyway, I went to mom's to get a generator because we had just gone through a snowstorm. We were getting ready to get another one. I was afraid my power was going to get knocked out. So I was going to take my generator and put it on the boat. And she started locking the doors on me and acting all crazy. And she said, if you don't leave, I'm going to call the cops. Well, I wasn't even there to talk to her. I was just there to get the generator. I didn't. So I said, well, go ahead and call the cops. I'll wait right here. She said, I'll do it. I said, well, you do it because I need to get in there and get that generator. You call them so we can get one over here. I didn't even know what she's fired up about. So anyway, a cop shows up in the driveway about 12 minutes later and saying, is Jessica here? And I said, yeah, that's my sister. So anyway, long story short, the cop said, well, can I come in and talk and find out what the problem is? And she said, I don't know. You've got a demonic aura around you. I can see it. And I don't know if I want you coming through my threshold or whatever. Well, you can see me. I am so, I was so glad because I know she was crazy. But sometimes how are you going to get somebody to manifest that craziness right in front of the police officer? You know what I mean? Yeah. But just on cue, she was like, aha, here's my crazy for everyone to see. So anyway,
what happened? What happened? What was the end result in that anecdote?
I got the generator. I took it back to the boat. Some bitch was heavy. I couldn't get it cranked. I ended up, the guy told me 7 boats down. Why don't you leave it for me a couple of days? I think I can get it cranked.
No. What happened with regard to the police? So did the police notice your demonic aura?
No. She was accusing the policeman of having demonic aura. She never accused me of that. So
Did the police cop to having a demonic aura?
No, but he threatened to take her down to the police station if she didn't come off of it, and she didn't come off of it. But my mother showed up and intervened and somehow convinced her that it's better to leave her there than take her down to the police station, because it would eventually, she would have to go deal with that. She would have to go bail out of jail. She would have to deal with her cursing all the way home after being in jail. It would just come down bad on her. And the cop agreed.
What's your racial ancestry? Are you Scots-Irish? What are you?
You know, I told you they dug up on my mom's side. They dug up my great grandfather and his whatever they called Hablo group. Now this is like, he served in the Continental Army, you know, there in Virginia. Apparently that side of the family had come from Virginia at that time. So his Habla group is from like Copenhagen, Sweden, or Copenhagen, Denmark, and like Malmo, Sweden, which is like right across the water there. So God only knows, you know, because that same little DNA study group also pulled up another family that he married a person from, and they had like the kind of DNA that's just like a soup of everything: Native Americans, black people, white people, you name it.
But for you, what's your primary racial ancestry? Is it Swedish? Is it Irish? What is it?
I really wouldn't know. I know that from the area that I come from, Luke, they're mostly Scotch-Irish.
Okay,
you know, but
so yeah, you feel Scots-Irish to me. You feel like you live in those you come from life in the borderlands.
You got to remember, Tennessee and Kentucky were basically frontier lands.
Yeah.
And the cemeteries where a lot of my ancestors come from was from those areas where they were coming through the mountain, you know, the little, through the little mountain trails, you know, and they settled just on this side. Yeah. So that's always, that could be a sign too that they were a little bit on the lawless sides, because you often had groups of people who just wanted to be, oh, this is where the law extends. I think I'll be like 100 miles on the other side of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's always
Have you ever had sex with a family member?
No, thank you, sir. No,
okay. Do you have all your
Not
teeth?
That I know of.
Not that you know.
Do what?
Do you have all your teeth?
I do have all my teeth. I do have all my teeth. So yeah, no problem. I have psoriasis. That's about the only thing that I can think that I've picked up along the way from from that particular family line. You know what that is? Psoriasis.
Yeah. Okay, you feel very Scots-Irish to me.
Yeah. Well, I think they were, but some of my cousins do still have like knotty curly hair, to where when they get out of the water, it's very knotty and very curly. But
wait, you were in Panama City. You were in Panama City, and you were asked not to return. What behavior were you engaging in that caused the police in Panama City to ask you to not return?
It was a brand of partying after a big Tennessee football victory that they weren't fond of.
Okay.
I don't know if there was too much destruction in the hotel room itself or whatever. I don't know, because one of the reasons I stopped drinking at like 22 was because I did get blackout drunk. So
how many cities in the United States are you effectively banned from?
I don't know, because I wasn't banned from my hometown, but when I noticed that the man was building a pretty good file jacket on me, and I could see he was thinking about pinning some things on me that he shouldn't, that's when I went to the Marines and became a cipher machine man. So, you know, so that's the way she goes. Oh, the other thing about the Marines, you know, they give it to you like a wish list of like, hey, what 3 things would you like to do? And I'd say, okay. First thing was like air traffic controller. That was like my number 1 thing. And the number 2 thing, because I'm a natural with numbers, was accountancy. That's called 0100 is the MOS in the Marines. And then fixing cipher machines was the last thing on my list, because that's what my dad had done. He had done that, and he had transferred that into a job that was making, 60 grand or more back in the 80s. That's some pretty good coin back then. So it was the least thing that I wanted to do. But that wish list wasn't for me, man. It was for them. They got to, it was their wish list. So that's one thing. If you do have any young viewers, that they should keep that in mind. And with the young people in mind, I wanted to ask you something about what matters most. What should the young people? What do you think the average age of your viewer is, Luke?
I think according to YouTube, it's like 55.
Oh shit! So you don't have that many young viewers, do you? Huh?
Not according to YouTube. According to YouTube, my audience is 100% male, and the average age is about 55.
Right. Well, like I mentioned, this Kardashian culture, this Lily Phillips and all this kind of stuff now, you got to wonder what they're shooting for. Is it going to be status? Is it going to be like take-home pay? Are they yearning for
I got an answer. I got an answer. This generation
go ahead.
And every generation previous, after meeting their immediate needs for shelter and food, their biggest desire is for status. But that's not new to this generation. That is the strongest human desire after you meet your physical needs. It's just that the way that status demonstrates itself changes generation to generation.
Well, apparently things like these you remember these lazy girl jobs where the girls get on TikTok and say, then I went to lunch and I ate here, and then I went back, had 3 more meetings, and then I went back, where they're just not doing anything. They're just stuck at the office for 10 hours a day. Apparently those do nothing lazy girl jobs have more status than, say, a plumber that makes $100,000 and $120,000 a year. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, in every situation, every generation, there are differing forms of status, and so, yeah, I think most people would prefer to make content for TikTok rather than work as a plumber.
So you see that status thing? It's not for that plumber guy. He's doing the right thing if he doesn't mind. I don't know. I've told you before. I started my first business at age 22. And the thing I noticed was it was lonely work. It was lonely work. And it wasn't necessarily for me. But if it was $120,000 a year as a young man, I don't give a shit if it was a lonely work. At that point, we have to figure out, okay, how can we take this paycheck and somehow turn it into status? Is there a way to do that for these young men if they have paycheck over status?
Of course, different people have different gifts and different needs for different types of status. What constitutes status among a group of philosophers is different from what constitutes status at a Chabad synagogue, from what constitutes status at an Anglican church versus a Pentecostal church. Right? Different communities have different hero systems and therefore different ways of measuring status.
Okay. All right. I got some note here. Let me just read it and see if it makes any sense, because it was from yesterday and you weren't around. So, I either had to write notes or call Elliott. Like I say, the man deserves a medal or a trophy or something. How to navigate a world where white men and women have deracinated and degenerated. Pay attention to the visuals each subgroup you encounter is exhibiting. It's harder to date unless you adapt to your surroundings while simultaneously holding to some baseline standards. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Maybe you got a good paying job, but there's the women have neck tattoos. You get what I'm saying? The women are the women make just enough money to start dabbling in drugs, and you got to hold to a standard there, even though you're in this new subgroup that ain't really your people. Take it from there, Luke.
Right. So we have a considerable amount of discretion about where we live, about what kind of skills we can bring to the table. And the more we are honest with ourselves, more effective we'll be in life, and the more we'll be able to situate ourselves where we want to be situated. Now, if one wants to live in a big city, an attitude of high in-group racial identity is not usually going to fly well, right? Most large workplaces are multiracial, multicultural, and if you go into that workplace with a 10 out of 10 in-group Black identity, gay identity, Chicano identity, Jewish or white identity, or Christian identity, it's not going to fly, because with intense in-group identity comes intense amounts of sense of victimization. So one wants to be able to navigate reality in the most effective means possible. If you have your life together to any extent, you're going to be able to have a lot of choice about where you live, where you work, where you worship, where you socialize, and your life will usually operate more effectively and more smoothly if you're able to live, work, and socialize in the highest IQ neighborhoods and with people who you feel like are your peers. And so it's not essential for a good life that your strongest identity be racial, right? You may be better off having your strongest identity be professional. You might be a surgeon and you want to hang out with other surgeons, or your strongest group identity might be religious, or it might be ethnic, or it might be on the basis of education. So in today's more wide open societies, all right, we all tend to have all sorts of different identities which rise and fall in importance depending on the situation. So there are going to be some contexts, such as at a sports bar watching a particularly intense football game, where my Dallas Cowboy fan identity is going to be the strongest of all my identities. Other situations, my Orthodox Jewish identity will be the strongest of all my identities. Other times, my American identity, or my Australian identity, or my professional identity as a writer, or as someone who does live streams on YouTube will come to the fore. Or it might be based on my intellectual interests. So we all get to have a lot of identities, and just boiling down all identities just to a racial identity usually won't serve people, whether they're black or white or yellow or brown.
I think when I was thinking about it last night, my thoughts were similar, different but similar to the whole thing of like, how do you adapt to the surroundings while holding to your standards? I just put keep enlarging yourself into new circles and take notes which groups seem to breed success. It's hard to fake it till you make it. You got to match the groups you associate with to your core values, ethics, and innate skills and traits. You're going to be happiest in the authentic state, if at all possible. And sounds like you would agree with that, no problem, right?
Right, and recognize that there are going to be certain situations that are going to be toxic for you. For example, if you spend time on a porn set, within 20 minutes, it will seem completely normal to you. Like you will lose the shock. You will lose the sense of repugnance, and suddenly everything will seem normal to you. So if in your social circle people start getting divorced, then divorce will become an option for you that you otherwise would not consider. If your friends are cheating on their spouses, then you're far more likely to cheat on your spouse. If your friends are engaged in dishonest forms of business, then you're going to be much more likely to engage in dishonest forms of business. So whatever group, crowd, situation that we find ourselves in, we will very quickly habituate to that and consider it normal, natural, and healthy, even if it's toxic and deadly.
And it sounds hypocritical. You can't even say you're because I don't feel like a moralist. That people would say it's hypocritical. You sound like a dope smoking moralist. You know what I mean? Because I don't feel like a moralist, but sometimes I feel like I get exposed as being on the other side of the culture. Like when that Ann Coulter went on a show with a guy named Father Albert. You ever heard of this guy, Father Albert?
No.
Well, anyway, he had a whole studio full, probably 200 women, and none of them had a man, and they all had kids and no man in the family or whatever. So Coulter was just trying to point out that statistically, these women would do better giving their kids over to adoption, to where they could be put with a mother and a father, because having both a mother and a father is the single best thing you can do for your children. And don't you know that this father with the little white square thing on his little black shirt, you know how the clergy does. At some point, she said she had to say, "Who's the Christian here, Father? I want what's best for the kids. Can't we just agree on what's best for the kids?" And I don't know, just to see a whole set full of loose women, and then you kind of realize, oh shit, that kind of the environment I saw at Booker T. Washington seems to be the environment at large now. Now, people like Luke Ford tells me that there are enclaves where this isn't the case, but I'm telling you, man, it is scary how fast that shit got mainstreamed. Any comment?
Yeah, do you remember the Girls Gone Wild era?
Yeah.
Well, that wouldn't fly today, right? We have become more sexually conservative than that era, right? The wider culture has changed since the Girls Gone Wild time. It's changed for the better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
So
well,
why do you think that is? I mean, we had Girls Gone Wild. We had a much more libertine culture in the 80s, the 90s, and the aughts, and now we have a more conservative sexual culture. So, to me,
why it's the
thing.
liberals. It's the godless liberals using cancel culture as something they can be religious about. You get what I'm saying? This in the same way that they get religious about climate change and the like, and LGBTQ rights and those gay crosswalks and whatever. They don't have anything sacred in their life, so they're going to glom onto this horse shit. That's what they glom onto, because even where they live, even the Catholic bishop wears the queer colors around his scarf. You know what I mean? So it's a real.
Wait, I'm confused. You think the Girls Gone Wild era was a better time? That was a healthier culture than the one we have right now, where that would be less socially acceptable?
Well, I mean, you're one of the main people. You agree with me that we liked it when people were a little bit more plain spoken. You know,
Yes.
He was a out and out hedonist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just like you used to be an out and out purveyor of all things pornographic. You get what I'm saying? So I like that forwardness. Everybody now playing on the sly. I don't like that, because generally speaking, the more money people have, the more perverse, they tend to be, because they have more money to indulge themselves in said perversions. You get what I'm saying?
Right. Would you accept that you have indulged in many perversions and vices that would destroy someone with fewer resources and less intelligence than yourself? The middle class, as Adam Smith noted in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, the middle class can often indulge in vices that would destroy someone from the lower class.
Yeah, and that's something I have to, I've always been a contrarian. I don't know if you consider yourself to be one, but I've always been a contrarian. So I don't know. I realized that the type of environment that I know that would be better for America long term would be something more of a stifling theocratic type of existence. And I guess I had to see everything degenerate so much. Really, Luke, what I think is going to happen is it just keeps on going. There's not, like I told you, the genie's out of the bottle. So it keeps going on and on and on and on. And either clever people like me or you can get people inspired enough to want to change. But then change what? I mean, it's one thing to change the women and con them into like not wanting to be whores again, get them to value long-term relationships again, get them to see that they've their strategy, because they only have so many eggs, you know what I mean? Their strategy doesn't need to be play in the field and then trying to grab a man late in the game. Their evolutionary strategy really needs to be the other way around. So even if we get them to embrace that, well, how are we going to get them to embrace the idea of going back home and being homemakers and all that? They love getting in there, dressing all sexily. So now you got me, like Patrice would say before he died, you got somebody like Luke Ford or Kip, a grizzly bear, is forced to go in there and work with salmons that have been dipped in honey. You know what I mean? Because they're wearing their skirts up to their ass now, Luke Ford. You get what I'm saying? They're wearing the shirts down to where you can see the titties. You can't slut shame them now. So how you going to roll that back out? How you going to roll that the other way, Luke Ford? You're not going to, I don't think. Do you?
Well, it's already occurred, right? We have a less sexually libertine culture now than we did in the 1980s, 1990s, and the aughts. So it is being rolled back. It hasn't perfectly rolled back, but it's rolled back somewhat.
Well, we'll just agree to disagree.
Okay, I'm gonna move on, man.
Did you like the Leonard Cohen? Did you recognize the Leonard Cohen?
I did not.
You did not. Well, that's who we were singing today. It was Leonard Cohen. That was for you, buddy.
Thanks, bro. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Okay, let's get a little bit more from this Billionaires show.
And there's just more, and the fact that we can kind of directly, in a lot of ways, Elon was the first one to directly defend himself. You remember when?
Well, do you remember when he fired his whole PR team? He fired all those people. There's none of that info.
Elon is a real mixed bag as any kind of role model for an entrepreneur because he says so many ridiculous, stupid things. I would not look to Elon as a good role model for how one should conduct oneself on social media, nor Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump's social media strategy, Elon Musk's social media strategy, it's not going to work for most people, right? Most people cannot stand the intensity of the blowback that Elon and Trump are able to navigate, right? Most people don't have the resources, inner resources, outer resources to handle the blowback from their outlandish public posting.
Infrastructure between him and everybody else.
But do you remember when he would be on Twitter all the time post PayPal trying to correct the story and just write long diatribes? And then when a New York Times reporter said something negative about a Tesla, he just went off for weeks about them. And it seemed a little crazy and deranged. And then you started to see that it worked. Like he actually, and we were told, don't defend yourself. If something bad is written about you, you're going to prolong the press cycle. You're going to make the journalists angry. And so we're now unshackled. I teach this class at Stanford and I taught 2 back-to-back on Monday. And I looked around and I saw half the placards said, she, her, he, him, his. And I got a little pang of like, oh, do I have to watch what I'm saying? Like, no, I don't. I'm unshackled. This is just me and I'm going to be Marc Unfiltered. And it's the better version of ourselves. So anyway, I'm glad.
Was socially celebrated in the early aughts, and it would not be celebrated today. Right? There's much more of a sense of the damage that sexual promiscuity can do today than I think there was in more libertine times.
That Zuck feels like he can present more of his complete self out there now, and I think we can get into it later, but I have a lot of thoughts on how the.
Okay, I was told that you couldn't hear me, so I was just making the point that out-of-wedlock births are way down now compared to previous decades, and the amount of sex that teenagers are having is way down now compared to previous decades, and that Girls Gone Wild culture would be far less likely to be celebrated today. You'd be less likely to have celebrities wearing Girls Gone Wild hats, as opposed to in the aughts when Brad Pitt and other celebrities would essentially wear Girls Gone Wild paraphernalia and celebrate that culture. So there are some definitive, specific examples of how our culture is more sexually conservative today compared to previous decades.
Culture is going to kind of move more towards base.
Back to the other question with Biden, that lunch you had, Did he seem like he was all there?
Come on. Yeah, come on, Marc.
Was it in the afternoon? I mean, did you have concerns about that? Because that
was he sharp as a tack?
Was he really
sharp
sharp as a tack? Well, that was the thing that broke me. I mean, I'm not saying I'm like full mag over here,
here's
but that was like, wait a second. Are you guys lying about this? Like, how long is this and how deep is this cover-up?
I have no horse in this race. I didn't have a horse in the race, so I had nothing to lie about. I for sure don't now. I'm really not a Biden fan or protector. I'll tell you, like my exact observation.
No culture can survive being sexually libertine. There will inevitably be a blowback. So it'll either be a religion and tradition-based blowback or it'll be a woke blowback. So now, having promiscuous sex on a college campus, right, you're far more likely to be brought up before some kind of university panel. So we have a feminist Me Too blowback against sexual promiscuity and sexual abuse. But there will inevitably be some kind of opposition to the social acceptance and even celebration of the male predatory sexual strategy.
We had this lunch. There was like maybe 5 of us with Biden and a few of his finance people. They had it in the tennis house, which is the way they found that they can have a fundraising lunch on the property of the White House. They found some way. We'll see if Trump does
some loophole, right?
Yeah, the loophole. And I was impressed with
Okay, a response here from Data. I think you're right. Certain things are less celebrated today, but younger people having less sex is more downstream from loneliness and social dysfunction. Well, it's a good thing that there is fewer births outside of wedlock. That's unambiguously a good thing. It's a good thing that fewer teenagers are having sex. And when you look at 1980s, 1990s, and the aughts sexual culture, you'll often recognize this would not fly today, right? The outrageous remarks that, who's that British comic who got Me Too'd recently, and he's gone from a Marxist to someone possibly dissident right. He was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall. So the way that the comics and public personalities would discuss their predatory sexual lifestyle, how they would say force oral sex on women until they cried, right? You get much less of that now thanks to the Me Too blowback. And some of the Me Too blowback is unfair, but a great deal of it, Russell Brand, yeah, but a great deal of the Me Too blowback is fair, is important, and has created a more conservative sexual culture where the natural predatory male sexual impulse is much less likely to be celebrated. So you watch mainstream media coverage of Girls Gone Wild from 20 years ago, and you'll immediately be jarred. You'd recognize this would not fly today. You're much less likely to have comics such as Russell Brand joking about making women cry through forceful thrusting and rough sex.
Long lunch. It must have been an hour and a half, 2 hours. And I'll tell you the good and the bad. The good, the part I was impressed was he kept the conversation thread. He was engaged and kept the thread the whole.
I had a friend, Marc, anyway, and he did a lot of marijuana. He became paranoid. And when I heard that he'd committed suicide, God forbid, I was relieved because he became such a pain. But he was something of an accomplished journalist, and he was very smart, was secular Jewish dude, and he had a funny line that he shared with me in 1999 that everything that I like to do in college is now a felony. So we've become a more repressive and litigious society, and in some ways that's good. In some ways that has served as an effective brake on predatory male behavior. Kip says, besides all the groping and raping, what does 40 miss most about mall culture? I never spent much time at the mall. I worked at a shopping mall, the Boyne Island Shopping Center, for 7 months, 1984-85, where I had a contract to do the cleaning and the landscaping. But mall culture never played a role in my life. I just never recall hanging out at a mall. It's completely foreign to me.
Time. When we say sharp as a tack or kept the thread, that's how we talk about like our 90-year-old grandparent or something. So I'm just saying the reality to me, he he did not seem mentally debilitated in the sense of dementia, but we were impressed that he was able to follow the conversation thread and then say,
But, okay, let me say it differently. Would you have had the same bar if it was Jamie Dimon sitting across from you for a 2-hour lunch?
No. So yes, it was, wow, your grandfather is holding up really well. Like your grandfather was able to have a whole lunch and hold the conversation. But it wasn't, I didn't walk away saying, I have to admit, I did not walk away saying, I think he's mentally unfit, but I did. But
so when everyone around you denies that Joe Biden is senile, all right, you're less likely to state the obvious: Joe Biden is senile. When your social circle denies that Joe Biden is senile, that's going to have a profound effect on your understanding of reality. So reality's out there. We're in here, and we have these prisms, we have these blinders, we have these filters on, and we tend to filter reality according to what's socially acceptable and socially heroic in our particular community. And so there are all sorts of communities, such as the one he's just discussing among Democratic Party elites, where it was socially unacceptable to notice that Joe Biden was senile and not up to the job. And so if your community severely frowns upon noting the obvious, right, you're going to be far less likely to notice the obvious. I think that's what happened here to this dude.
And I wasn't shocked, but I was like, okay, this is someone who's being really handled and managed by the people around him. And he's being told to show up here, say this. But I will say he was not on an obvious script, which I think famously he did some fundraiser at Vinod's house where he was reading a prompter the whole time. So wasn't reading a prompter. Yeah, that was it.
At a person's home, they brought a teleprompter for him to...
So people on the right, they had no problem from 2017 on noting that Joe Biden frequently appears senile, because that was completely socially acceptable to notice that part of reality. Now, there may be other parts of the reality that it's less socially acceptable to notice on the right. If you're of a particularly traditional type of religiosity, embracing the theory of survival of the fittest and Darwinian evolution, right, is not going to be socially acceptable.
To speak, wow, that's
you didn't hear
weird.
about that? Yeah.
I didn't, actually. That's new information. That's crazy. But I mean, in fairness, like there's this issue called sundowning. People who are in that age group, they're good in the day, and then the sun goes down, and their brains are exhausted.
So looking at Kip's comment, like Russell Brand, Luke implores pretty young women to come explore the tantric aspects of Alexander techniques like dogs. Well, Alexander technique teachers tend to be quite insecure. One, we almost all come from a background of great pain, and pain often has a psychological as well as a physical component. We embrace the Alexander technique because it releases us from this burden of pain. So we are already coming from that background of extreme pain. It's going to be an eccentric and insecure bunch of people. Also, the Alexander technique has no legal standing. It's not like being a doctor or a lawyer. Anyone can call himself an Alexander technique teacher. Also, your use of yourself is always on display whenever you're interacting with other people. So when Alexander technique teachers get together, we're noticing and often critiquing other people's use of themselves. So Alexander technique teachers tend to be insecure. And as a result, we do not make jokes such as what Kip just suggested. And so we don't make jokes about the tantric aspects of Alexander technique. And I notice when I teach the Alexander technique, even when I'm teaching, I've taught the Alexander technique to A-list models. And I go into a professional zone where while I'm teaching, I am not even spending time in anything erotic. All right. I just switch, my brain switches into professional mode. So it's going to be quite the rare teacher. Not many Alexander technique teachers get a reputation for screwing around with their clients. It does happen. It happened a lot more in the past than it does now. So over the decades, Alexander technique is professionalized. Now, there are quite a few Alexander female teachers who've gone on to marry their clients. And they often seem to be a little bit embarrassed about that. But yeah, you would get severely frowned upon. You would be kicked out of various Alexander Technique societies if you made any joke like what you just made.
And that's when you would see it. And that's what they said about the debate. But for me, that was the coronation of Kamala and like not actually having a speed run primary. That to me was.
Now, in private, say Alexander Technique teaching students might muse about what it'd be like to have sex with their particular favorite Alexander teacher, or in private, Alexander Technique teachers might share about giving a nude Alexander Technique lesson. But in public, you'll hear almost none of that kind of ribald humor.
It was just anti-democratic, anti-American, and like just what happened.
Right. The more insecure you are, the more insecure your group, right, the less likely you are to mock yourself and your group.
Happened to merit and like having a process here, right? Like that's when I felt like the party just
I'm glad
collapsed
you're
on
here.
its.
And think about incentives, right? If I was inappropriate in an Alexander Technique lesson, somebody could publicly shame me, call me out online. It would be effortless, and it could haunt me for the rest of my life. So I've got considerable incentives, along with every other Alexander Technique teacher, to be professional. You don't want to get sued. Insurance for Alexander Technique teachers is quite reasonable, something like $500 a year, because very rarely do you have disgruntled Alexander Technique students. But like a single charge, a single incident like this would end your professional standing in the Alexander Technique community, and it would haunt you for the rest of your life.
So,
I'm glad you're here. Let's jump in.
Okay.
But let me ask you a question before we get into the doc. We got a lot to talk about, obviously. But what do you think the Democratic Party does from here? Like, everybody's like this? They're lost in a drift. We're not even hearing from them. Maybe a little bit of pushback, I guess, at these Senate hearings right now for confirmations. But what do you think happens? Is there any hope for this? And who would lead them out of this? Shapiro, somebody, AOC?
I think that what my brain, like kind of intelligence.
Let's get into a little bit of an update here about the absolute tragedy occurring in Los Angeles. The death toll is now at 25. 12,000 structures have been destroyed. It's mostly people's homes. It's 40,000 acres. That's 60 square miles. I think San Francisco is.
So if you put my name into Google, right, and look at the news, right, there's some Scottish actor named Luke Ford who was found guilty of sexual abuse, catalogue of offenses over a 12-year period, including the rape of 6 women. Right, actor who claimed he was Brad Pitt's body double, jailed for rapes, including secretly not using a condom. Luke Ford's obsession with the movie branded the most sexually violent, the misogynistic film ever, right? American Psycho. All right, this Luke Ford is not me. Guys, this is not me, really. But there was some bloke who got arrested for some type of fiddling with a kid, and the Alexander Technique teacher told the police that he did nothing wrong. He was simply teaching the Alexander Technique.
7 by 7 miles, right? So this is a.
Oh, and there's the TV show Girls, where the lead character meets a guy at a party, and she asks him what he does for a living. He says he teaches the Alexander Technique. She responds, "That's the gayest thing I've ever heard."
A lot of space. It's bigger than all of San Francisco. The Palisades and Eaton fires are still burning, and as of Wednesday, 80,000 people were under evacuation orders. A couple of our friends lost their homes, and but they survived. But the stories of losing everything are just tragic. Every memory, all your personal documents, photos, art, whatever that you've collected over a lifetime. I just had 2 conversations with people, and they were just in shock. The estimates right now of damage are between $135 billion and $150 billion. This is some of the most expensive real estate on the planet. It's 10 times more costly than any other wildfire in history, according to reports. You might remember the Camp Fire near Paradise, California. That's about, 3 hours north of San Francisco, northeast? That one was $12.5 billion, just to level set it. And now people are talking about, and we'll talk about here today, what the recovery and rebuild effort might look like.
Okay, Richard Spencer is not a big fan of conservatism. He's not a big fan of any competition for people's attention. And so he writes on X, "Nothing says the return of traditional values like a senator's daughter flashing gang signs at the crypto ball." So this is Caroline Cruz meeting Snoop Dogg. And again, this isn't a gang sign, right? This is just a peace sign. And there are all sorts of indulgences and vices that people in the middle and upper classes can engage in with very little peril that would otherwise be devastating to people in a lower class. So when the middle class engages in gangster rap, it rarely leads to a life of gangsterism, right? It's just something fun and silly that they play with or listen to, all right, while doing their homework, for example. So pornography, right? Some people seem to be able to intermittently use pornography without any demonstrable harm. Some people can listen to gangster rap without any demonstrable harm. Some people can do drugs without any demonstrable harm. And yet for other people, particularly people in a lower class, people with fewer internal and external resources, like one single indulgence in extramarital sex or taking drugs will be the end of everything that they have built up. But different people have different ability to navigate vice.
Have you had traffic to disgraziad.com with all of this?
Yeah, right now, disgraziad.com is going to be redirected to Gavin or Karen Bass. I don't know which one is more disgraceful.
I mean, it's an incredible troll that you just redirected every week to whoever you're maddest at.
Yeah. Who would be more disgraceful in this situation, Gavin or Karen Bass? I think it's got to be Karen Bass for just being out of the country.
I think it would be quite funny if every week you actually gave an award and redirected the website to the person
I gave it to Karen Bass
believe.
this week. And before that, it was Jake Paul for that Tyson fight and the disgraziad.com. But it's the stakes have gone up. Gavin is now doing executive orders. One of them is to make it illegal to lowball offers to impacted homeowners for the next 3 months. I don't know what the point of that is. And the other one is to eliminate the Coastal Act's review of permits for the houses that are along PCH, I suppose. And he wants to extend key price gouging protections, quote, to help make rebuilding more affordable. Gouging is defined as raising the rent or price of other goods and services more than 10.
So I come from a free market University of Chicago style approach to economics. So I don't like price gouging laws. I think the market should be allowed to set the price, barring some weird set of facts. So if you interfere with these market prices, you get much more inefficient distribution of resources.
10% from the last marketed price. But it could be as little as 5%. It's just not clear. And then LA Mayor Karen Bass created a snitch hotline to report on any kind of price gouging and rents, which we've started to see. People are now naming and shaming Zillow and Redfin listings where you can see the previous history of what they were asking for a home or for rent. And obviously,
yeah, so my instinctive response is that this type of legislation is counterproductive, but someone does make a good case for it in a couple of minutes.
Obviously, the free market is making rental homes double in price. Freeberg, we talked a bunch about this, and I know, Pincus, I don't know if you're comfortable talking about it, but we had a whole conversation about your getting dragged by the Coastal Commission in Northern California. Freeberg, maybe kick us off here on what your thoughts are on rebuilding this area, how this will happen, especially with what we brought up last week. And I think went a bit viral is your sort of talk about putting your thumb on the scale with insurance. I mean, this is, I think, one of the concerning things here is the free market not being allowed to progress previously with insurance and then now with the rebuild.
Well, California's got, at this point, price controls or a mechanism for controlling the change in price on insurance, on housing services, and now they've got this non-solicitation rule. All three, I think, are very challenging to, I think, an appropriate market recovery. And look, the insurance issue is a longer one. If you guys want, we could talk about that. I've got a couple of notes I can bring up on the history of how we got to this point. But I think it's going to be one of the biggest burdens going forward, and it could actually lead to a pretty significant effect in long-term housing prices in California because of the way that the insurance market is structured and regulated in California. But if you want, we can talk about that.
Or up or down. What do you think ultimately, TLDR, do you think prices are going to go way up here? Do you think this is going to take 5 or 10 years to rebuild these homes? I mean, we've never seen this many structures go down at this price point in a constrained area where just construction is so expensive and hard.
So right, TLDR, excellent acronym, means too long didn't read. And so a normal, socially astute person is always checking in with his audience every 10 to 15 seconds to see if they're still following along. And unless you're getting cues that people are still with you, right, you just want to shut up. So the wise person pays some attention to the reception that his words are getting. And normally when you speak to blokes, at least, right, blokes won't allow you to just go on, repeating yourself. They'll just shut you up or redirect. Women tend to be nicer, and so you can just bloviate and they'll often let you get away with it, but they hate it in their heads.
I think the governor did a good job suspending the permitting requirements for the Coastal Act for affected homes and the CEQA review. Those are very important, I think, suspensions. But he also put in place this executive order for price gouging. And if you pull up the note, Nick, so he basically said California Penal Code Section 396, which prohibits price gouging during a declared state of emergency, will now extend indefinitely in this region. And in the language in that penal code, it says that businesses cannot raise the price of essential goods and services by more than 10% above their pre-emergency price for a specified period. And in this case, his executive order is indefinitely. So on an indefinite basis, you cannot raise the price of goods and services, which generally applies to consumer goods like food and emergency supplies, but it also applies to building materials and services related to housing work. So if you want to attract builders, if you want to attract contractors, if you want to attract electricians and plumbers to go to the LA area, you have to allow the market to do its job. If I'm a plumber operating in Sacramento or in Phoenix, and I'm like, man, I could make some money if I go to LA, you will see an influx of service providers and an influx of goods to support the rebuilding effort in Southern California. That's the way the free market should work. Is there's an opportunity in the market, folks show up, they say, great, I can make money, I'm going to come here and do this work. And as more folks show up, they begin to compete on price, and eventually the cost kind of normalizes, and you end up finding what is now the new fair market value between the bid and the ask. The people that are saying, hey, I'll do the work, they're the ask, and hey, I need people to do work, that's the bid, and you find a price. But the benefit of that is you increase the supply. You increase the supply of goods, you increase the supply of service providers, of contractors. There is a home building dearth right now in the United States. So this is an amazing opportunity because they can now move to LA, build homes, we can get a rapid reconstruction effort underway.
So yes, my instincts are free market, but I recognize that there is a strong case to be made for various forms of government intervention. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that businessmen seldom gather together without engaging in some conspiracy against the public. And Tucker Carlson once opened his show expressing sympathy for many parts of Elizabeth Warren's populist economic agenda. So I think there is a role to play where businesses, for example, must make it easy for you to click to unsubscribe. So there are many subscriptions that you may fall prey to where you have to make a phone call to cancel the subscription. So I am all for government intervention stopping that. And I am all for government intervention forcing businesses such as lenders to spell out exactly the terms for a loan, to spell it out in simple, short language. So, for example, perhaps you might require that the terms of a loan must be restricted to 2 pages. They must spell out very clearly in easy-to-read type the primary terms of a loan, because without government intervention, right, businesses will often join together in a conspiracy to defraud the public, to rip people off, to take advantage of people. So you can make a good case for some government intervention here.
Except the governor just said we can't pay people 10% higher than what they were getting paid right before this happened on an indefinite basis. And then Karen Bass created a hotline. You can go to LA 311 and report people if they're trying to charge too much. And then the Stasi will come and investigate you and determine that you're charging too much. I understand that there's a strong moral imperative and incentive to say we got to stop price gouging. We don't want people to get hurt. But the second order effect is you're actually hurting the market and you're hurting the rebuild effort because you're reducing the incentive for folks to come in and fill the void in the market that is necessary for us to accelerate the development of 15,000 homes in a very...
So Ronald Reagan's trade policy is an example of what I like. He had free trade advocates in his administration, and he had protectionists in his administration, and they would often go to places like Japan and threaten more extensive protectionist tariffs if Japan did not engage in certain behavior. So big case for free market, let it rip. And there's also a substantial and perhaps equally strong case for various forms of government intervention. and probably a good idea to hear both arguments and to recognize that in certain situations that the free market approach will be more productive, and in other situations a more government interventionist approach will be more useful.
Very short period of time. The alternative now is people are going to be sitting around, and I already spoke to a couple friends, I'm sure you guys have, that are like, I tried calling architects, I tried calling contractors, people that live in this area that have been affected. I cannot get anyone to return my call. There is not enough service providers down there. You're going to end up.
And the chat recommends Depo-Provera for the low IQ. So having kids perhaps should be a privilege, and perhaps one should have to demonstrate one's pro-social bona fides to get a license to have kids. You have to have a license to drive a car. Why should you not have to have a license to have kids? For example, we could have a society where everyone gets the Depo-Provera shot, a long-term birth control shot, say every female starting at age 13, and you only get to go off the shot if you have demonstrated your pro-social bona fides, such as by graduating from high school, not being criminally convicted, right? You should perhaps have a number of law-abiding, upstanding adults who vouch for you that you are worthy of having kids or having a driver's license, right? I'm a believer in vouch nationalism, that there are all sorts of privileges that should be perhaps accorded, at least in part, on a basis of law-abiding adults who will vouch for you. And if you can't get 5 law-abiding adults to vouch for you that you are worthy of having a driver's license, then perhaps you should not be allowed to get a driver's license. And there should be a price to pay for those who vouch for you if you misbehave, right? If you misuse the privilege that society has accorded you, such as a driver's license, and you drive badly, perhaps those who vouch for you should then be on the hook for the damage that you have done. And so that will incentivize people to be quite choosy with those with whom they give a vouch. Let's get Elliott Blatt back onto the show. Elliott, what's going on, man?
Can you hear me? Hold on. I'm
yes, sir. Sure can. When is the 10-year anniversary for the Luke Ford live stream? Did we pass it already? So good question. And yeah, I think it was in 2015 with Jessica and her sister talking about the Torah portion. So I'll see if I can dig it up. All right, Elliott.
Okay. I wanted to, so you're on this topic, and I sort of put two comments in the chat about this idea of subsidizing the right people and disincentivizing the, what's the word, anti-subsidizing the wrong people.
Yes.
And I think there's an easier way to do it than vouch nationalism. I absolutely, applaud the idea, the spirit behind vouch nationalism. But we have simple things that we could do that are just not quite as onerous. Like, if you're law-abiding, and this is the tricky part, you demonstrate high IQ, so there would be this is the part that would not go down well. But if you're a high IQ person and you're married, I think it's perfectly acceptable and desirable for the state to assist you in getting a place to live. And this is a big departure from sort of I have the same sort of free market inclinations as you, but I recognize that this is not that. And I'm perfectly happy to deviate that, given what we see now.
Right. We really need to end dysgenic trends, which means since the Industrial Revolution, any society, once it's joined the Industrial Revolution, fertility trends have switched from being eugenic to dysgenic, meaning we're getting dumber every generation. And so we really need to incentivize smarter people to have more children and dumb people to stop having kids.
Yeah. So I was wondering, is there a way that Trump, can sort of sneak this in somehow? I mean, if he goes, here's my theory. If he just goes all in, all out, right out of the gate, there'll just be too much for his critics to respond to, right? And
yes.
and so therefore a certain amount of what we would recall based and good stuff would be allowed to slip through without opposition, just because the firestorm would be just so intense. The blitz that Trump goes on is so intense.
So there are two separate categories here: good ideas and ones that can be implemented. And so there is a time and a place and room for simply proposing good ideas, whether or not they can be practically implemented. And so I remember in 2015 and 2016, I would talk about, why don't we just take over Canada and everything south of us to the Panama Canal. I didn't talk about Greenland, but I would just talk out loud about why not make the United States bigger. And so Trump would talk about taking Greenland in his first term. So there's a time for just introducing good ideas or possible ideas into public discussion. And that's great. And then there's what you can implement. So one thing that we do know is that the more generous the welfare you provide, the more dysgenic trends you get. On the other hand, the less generous the welfare that you provide, particularly single mothers, the less dysgenic the trends. So squeezing welfare creates a less of a dysgenic trend in our fertility.
Yes, everybody knows this, but nobody wants to do it because they fear the repercussions in law and order terms should a certain community be deprived of their gift, as it were, right?
Well, we
held hostage.
We have dialed back welfare. For example, Bill Clinton signed into law something that was essentially workfare that did substantially diminish just sending welfare funds to single mothers. And as a result, we had a reduction of dysgenic trends. We have done it, and we can do it again. Now, this legislation was subverted by the Obama administration, but we can go back to disincentivizing women from having children out of wedlock.
Do you think that's on the agenda for Trump?
I'm not aware of it, but it's certainly Trump and Republicans, your generic Republican, is going to be less likely to provide generous welfare for single mothers. So compared to the alternative, there's going to be less of it under Trump.
Yeah. Okay. So Trump takes office tomorrow at noon?
That is correct, sir.
And last time he took office, the day one, there was this onslaught of executive orders that he did. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And it was sort of exciting, you know?
Yes.
And I'm just hoping there's a repeat of that, and I hope he sort of doubles and triples down on what he did.
Remember all the chaos at airports he implemented a Muslim ban right away?
Oh, I don't remember that.
No. Oh, yeah, that was rich. Like all sorts of people were stunned that he was actually going to follow through on some of the things that he campaigned on. And some very smart people in my Orthodox Jewish community, it was like, whoa, so Trump is really going to do the things that he said? Because I was the only one in my community who was pro-Trump from from the middle of 2015 on. And so I was looked to as something of a seer when he did indeed win the election, because I would have peers who tell me, oh, I know things that you don't know, because they were plugged into their friends at Fox News who would give them information about how there's no way that Donald Trump could win the Republican nomination, et cetera. And they'd give me this condescending, I know things that you don't know. And when they all turned out to be wrong and Trump got elected, then people suddenly treated me with a strange new respect. And then they were shocked when Trump took office and implemented some of the things that he campaigned on.
Yeah, you were sort of like an Ann Coulter, Bill Maher situation.
Yes.
Where there's a certain, there is a side benefit for engaging with the world as it is and, respecting reality, because it does give you it gives you a little bit of an omniscience, or not omniscience, but
you see things more clearly.
The future, because you're working from sound premises.
Right.
And
Steve Saylor, the first time that Steve Saylor thought Donald Trump could really win this thing in 2016 was when a Black Lives Matter activist murdered 5 cops in Dallas.
Oh, I remember that. Oh, I thought that was after he was inaugurated.
Nope, that was in the summer of 2016. And after the Pulse nightclub shooting, when a Muslim terrorist slaughtered, 30, 40, 50 people at a nightclub in Florida. So these events, remember when there were like Muslim terrorist atrocities, it seemed like every week?
Yes.
And then once Trump took office, they basically stopped.
Mm. Yeah. And what I noticed, do you remember when Reagan was inaugurated?
Yes.
And I think the Iranian hostages were released, I think, on that very same day.
Yes.
And I think that was calculated and scripted. And that was a publicity coup on Reagan's part,
Mm-hmm.
And now we have something vaguely similar where there's this hostage deal with in Israel. And, I think a lot of liberals are just getting those Reagan feelings all over again, and they're not happy about it.
Yeah. No, you're right.
The Trump approach works, that the conservative approach works. They don't want evidence of that to be circulated. And so they're getting hit with a double whammy of these sort of seemingly DEI policies having failed, and then these sort of anti-DEI policies succeeding at the same time. And that this is from the crowd that has threatened to leave the U.S. should Trump be elected. So
right. I've got a anecdote for you. So, are you aware of the Munich Olympics back in 1972 when the Israeli Olympic team was slaughtered by Palestinian terrorists? Okay.
I'm aware of it. I don't remember it. Obviously,
okay. So there's a new movie out about ABC Sports' coverage of that incident, and one of the many shocking things about that incident was how inefficient and inept the Germans were, because we tend to think of the Germans as being particularly efficient and effective, and they were just a complete clown show with regard to that terror attack. But I was in Munich at that time.
No way.
Our family was traveling Europe, and my dad's best friend was in Munich, I believe. I'm waiting for multiple confirmations. I got one confirmation from a family member, but my dad's best friend was doing a PhD at a university in Munich, and we were staying with him at the time of the Munich Olympics. And I'm not sure I have any direct memories, but there's always been this kind of strange resonance with regard to those events when I read about them or watch documentaries about them. But I was there. I was in that city, I believe, when that happened. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing this new movie. But it's interesting to kind of retrace one's life and recognize where one was. I don't have many early memories, but I have a vague memory of my mother. She died when I was 3. And I have a vague memory of my mother protecting me from the rage of my sister, because I'd gotten into my sister's perfume collection and smeared it everywhere along with toothpaste. And then my sister started beating me, and my mother crawled out of her sick bed and wrapped herself around me, saying, "He's just a little boy." And I vaguely remember her feeding me scrambled eggs. I vaguely remember the snow in Jerusalem. We were in Jerusalem in December of 1970, and I have vague memories of the Munich Olympics. And then I remember the Yom Kippur War, radio news reports about the Yom Kippur War. But otherwise, I don't have a lot of strong, definitive memories before age 8. How about you? Do you have memories from your very early?
I think my earliest memories are around age 5. After that, it's just this. Before that, it's just this vague haze of, just selected events that are more or less not meaningful. So, yeah, I know what you mean. So no, but I do remember my first day of kindergarten, which was age 5. So that's where I start. But it's weird to only not have any memories of your mother. That's a unique, not unique, but it's a pretty rare.
Yeah, she died when I was 3, and I think I have a memory of her feeding me scrambled eggs. And then I developed from that a narrative that I prefer my eggs scrambled. But once I went to UCLA and I had scrambled eggs cooked for me by that school cafeteria, that ended my attraction to scrambled eggs.
Yeah, it's the only way I can eat eggs. I scrambled, by the way. Interesting bit of Elliott trivia. So anyway, I didn't have much to say beyond that. I just wanted to, but so I do think the housing, so Kip and I think agree with each other about economics and the importance of getting that right, and are less free market oriented than you, it seems. And so, someday when my thoughts are fleshed out, I think it would be worth hashing that out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Because I've moved, like Trump has moved me away from a free trade approach. So I've modified my views since Trump.
Yeah, and I've just have been becoming a growing hatred of Elon Musk and the Silicon Valley bros. The more I think about it, the more ridiculous they seem. And so I seem to have moved away from Elon and Elonism and Vivekism and tech broism. I think this is I think we need to start thinking more clearly about technology and what it's actually bringing versus what its claimed benefits are. So, my thoughts aren't that well developed around this, but we're not thinking about technology clearly. We're talking about things that don't exist, like cryptocurrency and trips to Mars, all these things that don't really impact the quality of life here on Earth. And I think Elonism is preventing us from thinking about it clearly.
So have you been close socially to the startup world? Were you ever close to joining a tech startup in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I've only ever worked in startups, except once. I worked at an advertising agency for 2 years. But yeah, so I'm very close to this culture, and I don't fit in, right? I'm not, and my problem, what's hampered me is that I'm an outcast ideologically. I don't think like these people. I have different values. And so I don't enjoy socializing with them because they like to talk about things that I don't like to talk about. And they sort of are bought into this vision that I am not bought into. And so I'm always sort of the odd man out. So, I'm in the industry, so to speak, but I'm not part of it, if that makes any sense.
Now, which communities do you feel most at home in?
I feel craftsmen. So woodworkers, carpenters.
People like Jesus.
People that build things, people that do tangible things. And so auto mechanics, people that are able to accomplish practical and necessary things. I feel this is the country boy in me,
And how much time do you get to spend with such people?
Not much, bro. Not much.
So the community that you feel most at home in is a community that mainly exists in your imagination.
Well, but it didn't always exist in my imagination. It's been, at least in the city, those skills aren't appreciated. And so, San Francisco is, highly tech dominated. And so we have a lot of abstract virtual people. We don't have, but it used to have communities of artists and, traditional styles of art and craftsmanship and appreciation for. So if you come to San Francisco and you see these Victorian houses, you recognize, the value of what a skilled carpenter can create, and the people that just moved in just sort of have inherited that, but they have none of the values and none of the skills that brought that about. And they have no respect for the skills that brought that about. So that culture that I was attracted to San Francisco in the beginning has all but disappeared.
Well, I think you belong to the city. You belong to the night, living in a river of darkness beneath the neon light. You were born in the city, concrete under your feet. It's in your moves. It's in your blood. You're a man of the street, Elliott.
Who is that? I don't recognize.
Glenn Fry. You belong to the city.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to get out, but you do make a good point though. I do tend to romanticize the country. And then when I actually get out there, I don't fit there either. So I don't know. It's the cross I have to bear. But anyway, look, I'm in the midst of a big house cleaning binge.
Blessings.
I got to keep on or I'm going to lose momentum.
Blessings.
All right, blessings.
Okay, keep on keeping on. Thank you for everything you do for America. Let's get a little bit more from the tech bros here.
Waiting 6-7 years to get your home rebuilt. Now what do? You own a lot. You don't have a home to live in. And then there's this other thing where we can't take unsolicited offers on the home. That was the other executive order. So if you want to pull that one up, the governor said it is illegal to make an unsolicited offer on a piece of real estate in one of these affected zip codes. I don't know what that happened in Hawaii that makes the governor keep referencing the Hawaii story as if, that.
So when I listen to this free market critique, I think, oh, yeah, I completely agree with this. And then when I listen to the following rebuttal to this free market critique, I think, oh, yeah, I agree with this.
There were people that were taken advantage of, and we need to protect the citizens of LA. But I'm pretty sure that having an increase in the number of offers coming in for real estate in one of these affected areas increases liquidity in the market, it increases the buying behavior, and that will ultimately drive prices up, and that will ultimately make it easier by having more liquidity for some of these folks who owned burned down lots to be able to sell their lot, take their insurance check, move to another neighborhood, and go somewhere else because they're going to have to otherwise wait 6 or 7 years to build a home.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I think you're a little bit off the deep end with some of this stuff because I think you're not being totally fair in representing what this EO says. And that's coming from me. I mean, I am not a Newsom fan, okay? And I think he is completely and totally incompetent. But I'll just take the other side of this, which is that I read the EO, and I actually think it's somewhat reasonable. And I didn't connect the dots with the EO and the real estate market. And the reason is that if you read all of what he said, the EO is hyper-specific to unsolicited offers to a very specific handful of zip codes, and it was time-boxed for 3 months. So he said, making any unsolicited offer to an owner of real estate property located in the areas encompassed by, and he names a bunch of zip codes. I think there was like 1, 2, there's like 12 or 13 of them. Okay.
So it's so much easier to deny the legitimacy and the truth value of contrary opinions when you don't listen to contrary opinions. But when you open yourself up to contrary opinions, it's hard not to say, oh, this contrary opinion, which goes against my free market tendency in this case, it makes some good points.
So unsolicited, okay?
Yep.
To acquire any interest in real property for an amount less than the fair market value of the property on January 6th, so before the fire started. And
before the homes burnt down.
And he said that's prohibited for 3 months. That's it, for 3 months. And the reason I think he said that is that if you just scope out a little bit, just from this moment in Los Angeles, the problem is that after natural disasters, there is a spike in fraudulent activities. And there are people that try to take advantage of that situation to make money. So, for example, after hurricanes, we saw this in Florida, people pose as contractors. They come in and they offer inflated prices. They offer poor quality of work. And especially when you sort of deregulate for that moment, where there's less checks, there's less folks involved because you're trying to speed up the process, you can have a bunch of pressure tactics that work against the best.
Okay, Kip has some points. Smartphones have been a disaster for relationships. Well, they don't seem to have been a disaster for the upper middle class and the upper class, that they've been a disaster for people more anxiously attached and more prone to addictions. So we will become more aware, I think, as a society of the dangers of pornography, the dangers of gambling, the dangers of smartphone. But these dangers are not equally distributed to all people, right? There are some activities that are incredibly dangerous for some persons and not dangerous for other persons. So I think if you are spending too much time with your smartphone, it may say more about you. It may be a symptom of a deeper problem that you might have, such as anxious attachment. And it's just the smartphone that brings this emotional addiction to the fore. So how do we repair this without sounding like a Luddite? It warps one's sense of self. Well, I think when you do the inner work, when you recognize that you've got some kind of emotional addiction operating in your life and you do the inner work to gain emotional sobriety, all right, then the symptoms of smartphone addiction or gambling addiction or debting addiction or spending addiction or under-earning addiction, then these symptoms will diminish, right? People develop a smartphone addiction or a porn addiction because it's a solution to an underlying anxiety, an underlying sense of worthlessness, right? People don't drink to excess to hurt themselves. They start taking up that process because it helps them to numb out, to what's going on inside of them. So the more someone is able to achieve emotional sobriety, the less likely they are to fall victim to these symptoms. So for the person like Pete Hegseth who drinks to excess, that's just a symptom of an underlying problem of being ill at ease with himself. And simply stopping drinking may make that lack of ease with himself an even bigger problem, because he is going to have to do without his solution. If you blow with the wind, Kip writes, they will claim your thoughts aren't anchored. If you hold fast to a belief, they'll claim you deny new evidence. So ideally, you don't want to blow with the winds, and ideally, you don't want to ignore new evidence. You want to be somewhere in between. So there are certain beliefs that are rooted in reality that you don't want to lose, and there are other beliefs that are not rooted in reality that you want to discard. So there's a time and a place for changing your mind. When I am on my smartphone, I am watching you and your friends, 40. What does that say about the US? Well, I think when people listen to podcasts or watch live streams, they're usually doing something else. So it's an excellent accompanying activity. This talk radio, podcast, etc., is an excellent activity to take with one when you're walking, when you're doing chores, when you're working out. And it's a way to feel some sense of connection and to learn some things and to receive some degree of entertainment while you are moving through the more prosaic parts of your life. Smartphones have inflated the value of young women and new job applicants who all think they deserve it. They deserve everything on day one. Well, if one has an inflated view of one's own value, you will be rapidly disillusioned and humiliated by life. Right? You're not going to be able to sustain that in the weight of contrary evidence. For example, I converted to Orthodox Judaism. If every Orthodox synagogue I encountered said, we don't consider you Jewish, you don't count in a minyan, you are not part of our community, it would be increasingly difficult for me to maintain my identity as a convert to Orthodox Judaism, right? We all depend on other people providing ballast and support for our beliefs. And if the outside world refuses to support our beliefs, those beliefs usually will change. Right? It verges on the impossible to sustain any intense beliefs that are consistently diminished and mocked and denied by the world outside of us. Right? Much of our own internal reality is shaped by our interactions with people outside of us.
It's interests of the person trying to rebuild. On the wildfire side, there was this crazy thing, Nick, I'll send you the link from KTLA that talked about these folks called fire chasers, which are essentially like, wildfire scammers. They're ambulance chasers, but during fires.
Okay, so
my point is, I don't disagree with his incompetence, okay? And I think he is totally out of touch. I think there's a broken cartel that runs this state that's going to drive this state into just complete disrepair. He was grossly negligent. Well,
no, they're already in.
You can't say a state that has $322 billion budget is already bankrupt. It's teetering on a path where we won't be able to return, and we can debate that. But my point is, I just think, despite all of this, he's grossly negligent. Karen Bass is grossly negligent. The California cartel is breaking the state. But on this specific narrow thing, I kind of will give him his flowers. I think it was like a decent, smart, good thing. It's narrowly focused. There's a specific window here that's time boxed so that the worst behaviors of other people are roughly managed and mitigated until we can figure out a better answer.
You're saying that unsolicited offers on real estate can drive fraud?
What you talked about, if there is a person that is, this does not prevent somebody from selling.
Let's talk about services separately, because he has a separate EO on services.
This does not prevent anybody whose house burned down from listing his lot.
That's right.
You could sell it for $1.
That's right.
So I think it's not right, and it's inaccurate to say that this is perturbing and distorting the free market. The idea that you cannot sell isn't what is in this EO. The idea is some person shows up out of the blue and applies a pressure tactic to you when you're in a very stressful situation trying to deal with your insurance brokers, trying to figure out where your kids are going to go to school.
But they're just making an offer. What's the pressure tactic? Why can't someone make an offer on your home? You want people to bid up homes.
David, here's what's going to happen. There are people that in the middle of all of this stress are trying to figure out how much money they can get. Somebody shows up and underbids what the true price discovery could be in a few months from now. You don't know whether you have to still pay back your mortgage. There will be people, it'll be non-zero, that will make a mistake. And I think that it's good to try to stop that. It doesn't absolve him from his incompetence, but this, I think, was reasonably good.
What about the services piece, Chamath? The fact that you can't increase pricing on goods and services by more than 10% for an indefinite period. Don't you think that creates a disincentive for service providers to come into the state to come and address the.
Well, obviously it does, yeah.
This grand ideal of the free market will solve everything isn't necessarily always true. It's great in theory. It reads well in a textbook, but real life is messy. Right now, we are in the messy part. And we are in the most critical part where the abuses will be the highest. I suspect that in 6 months and 9 months and 12 months, the free market will sort all of these things out. So if there's a governor who can implement some checks and balances to protect these folks who are probably totally dazed, like, for example, we know some of our friends. I've spoken to them over the last few days. I've spoken to their wives. Honestly,
they're in shock.
I'll say it in a horrible way. One person said this to me, and I'll just quote him. The amount of people that have reached out to me, if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, why would so many people reach out with condolences? I would have thought that one of my children had died. That's what he said to me. And it completely struck me with, it's not on that same level, but the amount of emotional turmoil that these families are going through probably approaches that. I don't think many of those people are in a condition to make good decisions right now. So I almost think a cooling off period actually benefits everybody. It can allow the free market to work in a few months from now. We're only talking 90 days.
No, the services thing is indefinite. That's what I think is a little bit frustrating.
Let me bring Marc in here. Marc, you heard both sides of this debate. If you had a lot in the Pacific Palisades that burned down and people started making unsolicited offers, listen, you're sophisticated. I've known you for 20 plus years. You're very sophisticated, obviously. But do you think that's a reasonable thing to do, to put a moratorium on people making these low bid offers? And then we'll get to the construction piece second. But, you know, what do you think of these
unsolicited offers?
Yes, unsolicited offers. Yeah. What do you think of that?
I think what bothers me about it, there's a presumption, and maybe Chamath's right in it. You're getting me to think about it a little more than I was, but I'm pretty much where Freeberg is, that we're kind of treating these people like children, because what we're saying is that they're not capable of making good decisions. So we need to protect them from themselves. And we're saying, so we don't want you to know that somebody is willing to pay X dollars for your property because you might take it and you might regret later that you took that, is kind of what Chamath is saying.
No, and in a very narrow window where you may not have the best and clearest ability to make the best decision for you because you're dealing with so many other crazy issues in your life.
And
you can still say no.
You could say no, but you're presuming there's one side that bothers me that feels like what we've had from the Democratic Party forever, which is that this big, wise overlord that's going to protect us from ourselves, from our worst natures. And then on the other hand, you're bringing up something, Chamath, that I hadn't thought about, that I'm just thinking more about now, which is
some degree of nanny state or some degree of protection from ourselves is probably a good thing. Comment in the chat. There's a feature film directed by Steven Spielberg called Munich about the 1972 terror massacre by Palestinians against the Israeli Olympic team. Yeah, I've watched it several times. And when the movie sticks to the facts and to the actions, it's a righteous movie, because if you're on the right, if you have a traditional hero system, you understand that you need to punish people who do bad things, and the capital punishment is often the best response to murder. And so when that movie shows Israel going after and killing terrorists, right, it's showing something that's true and accurate. But the movie is directed and written by leftists, and so the words that accompany the action are all about how retribution is self-defeating, that vengeance is not a tenable strategy, that the punishment for committing evil is not such a great idea. So big distinction between the left and the right throughout history, right? Going back thousands of years, more right-wing societies are more interested in stiff punishments for violating communal norms, such as committing criminal violence. People on the left, much less interested in punishment, much more interested in rehabilitation. People on the right tend to be at ease that all forms of punishment contain some vengeance, right? Vengeance is not in and of itself a bad thing. There are appropriate amounts of vengeance. There are appropriate uses of vengeance. There are appropriate degrees of vengeance. So I presume you're right wing, and I would presume, therefore, that you stand for more punishment for violent criminals than your average American. And I would presume, if you're watching this show, in all likelihood, you favor capital punishment for murder. It's just a classic right versus left difference. It's a classic Republican versus Democrat difference. Your generic Republican will be more supportive of capital punishment and stiff punishments for violent criminals than your generic leftist and Democrat. And I'm all for appropriate amounts of vengeance, punishment, and for killing murderers. Israel does not have the death penalty. The only time they used it was against Adolf Eichmann. I wish Israel had the death penalty. I wish that murderers were executed in Israel, in Australia, in the United States. But among our intelligentsia, who are dominantly on the left, is considered enlightened to be opposed to vengeance and to have great skepticism of punishment and to be completely opposed to capital punishment. So that's a classic example why people on the right are out of touch with the dominant intellectual trends of the last few years. Kip says, smartphones put forward the worst role models, such as Lily Phillips, which permeate online spaces and in real life. OnlyFans is the natural progression when money justifies all. Well, it's how you use the smartphone, right? There are plenty of people who don't see Lily Phillips and other OnlyFans creators as great role models. But I'm sure you can make a case how technologies such as smartphones does tend to act as an acid against traditional commitments, which is why the most traditional communities tend to have the greatest hesitancy, if not outright opposition, to smartphones. OnlyFans did not evolve to be gullible, but the incels fapping their lives away sure did. Well, the people who use OnlyFans, they are choosing it because it reduces the pain of their life, right? A maladaptive use of OnlyFans is a symptom of a deeper soul rot. It's a symptom of a deeper disconnection with reality and with other people. People's lives are not going downhill because of OnlyFans. Their maladaptive use of OnlyFans is a symptom of a life that was not headed in a good direction prior to OnlyFans. So yeah, OnlyFans, alcohol, spending, these can all exacerbate, exaggerate, and multiply self-destructive tendencies. But it finally comes down to the individual's soul.
Well, maybe people could be taken advantage of at the margin because they feel like they're in a dire position. But if they think they're in a dire position, they might really be in a dire position. So they might really.
Well, for example, let's just say that you haven't heard back from the bank.
So the Houston Texans got screwed over by the refs in their game with Kansas City Chiefs. And one of my favorite sports commentators is Skip Bayless. Let's see what Skip has to say.
Just finished watching Texans at Chiefs. It made me sick at my stomach. I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight because I'll keep thinking about those two outrageous phantom penalties, 15-yard flags thrown for Patrick Mahomes. The NFL protected Patrick Mahomes and made sure he's getting back to yet another home AFC championship game that will give him a great shot at getting to yet another Super Bowl game, whose ratings will go through another roof, this one in New Orleans, because of the Swifties. The NFL is now prisoner of the Swifties. It's protecting Patrick Mahomes through the referees, game after game after game, to ensure that the Swifties will come back and watch game after game after game. Mahomes has turned into the biggest flop artist in the game, and the refs buy it because the refs got the memo. Get the Swifties to the AFC Championship game. Get Taylor Swift back in the box. And please, somebody tell me what possessed Caitlin Clark to associate with Taylor Swift. Caitlin, you're better than that. You're bigger than she is. Stay on your own path. Blaze your own trail. You don't need Taylor Swift and the Swifties. You've got the Clarkies. There are billions of them. Come on, I've lost a little respect for you, Caitlin.
And then last night, who was expecting the Washington Commanders to defeat Detroit and to put up 31 points in the first half? I was shocked at how good Washington looked. What an incredible game last night. Just so much fun. I was surprised by how much opposition Green Bay put up against Philadelphia last week. I sure hope that the Los Angeles Rams couldn't defeat my Dallas Cowboy arch rival Philadelphia Eagles this afternoon. Right. Cutting commentary here by Marc Halperin, Friday evening.
To write a book. We'll see about that, but that's what the white aides are saying. Also
Biden.
on Joe Biden, New York Times story published a little while ago. 4 top reporters byline, and if you look at the headline, put up the headline, please. You'll see it purports to be about this extraordinary story, one of the great stories and most outrageous developments in my career, and I think in American history, how Biden's inner circle protected a faltering president. Okay, that suggests perhaps the New York Times is finally going to get into the game, which the Wall Street Journal has been in, to say the decade-long cover-up of his decline of mental acuity, almost a decade, and the media's role in that. Incredible story, right? A very long story, 4 powerhouse bylines, extremely disappointing. They do what the New York Times has done, almost with a few exceptions, which I'll get to, almost throughout this controversy, this collusion, this conspiracy, which is they print the claims of Biden aides and Biden friends as if they're true. And there's so many examples of the public displays of loss of mental acuity they don't even mention. And what they do, again, if you read the whole thing in its totality, what they're accepting is he got tired because he traveled too much. He is physically declined, so he looked older. That it was a political problem rather than a medical problem, and that in some high-profile instances, like on foreign trips and at the debate, the problem was he was traveling too much and he was tired. But that in the main, he was exceptionally on top of everything. The story ends with an anecdote from a guy who was his aide in the 70s, who said he visited him at the White House and watched Biden edit a speech and tell people what edits he wanted, and it was like being back in the beginning of his career, hasn't lost a step. There's a few new anecdotes about people confronting him about his decline, or confronting aides about his decline. Again, I say with respect, I think the New York Times is, despite all its flaws, one of the great institutions in the country. This story is an embarrassment, and the senior editors of the paper should have killed it and said to the reporters, this story is just going to reinforce the perception that we were part of the cover-up, that we're not interested in getting to the bottom of this, because as I said, they didn't even report stuff that's on the public record. Okay, a couple things from the story. They say in one paragraph, White House aides chastise White House correspondents for coverage of the president's age. That's true, they did. It's a big part of the cover-up. They try to intimidate any reporter who would talk about this to write about it. Just putting that sentence in without specifics, because I can tell you it happened to New York Times reporters. They may say, well, these attempts to chastise us, or these chastisements were off the record. I wouldn't take that off the record. I wouldn't take being chastised about this off the record. So here's the paragraph that kills me. It just infuriates me, because this is so important for history and for accountability. This should never happen again. We should never have an emperor's new clothes conspiracy between an administration of either party and the press corps. So they run through. They say that the efforts to shield him were about the fact that he got cranky, or he was demanding, or he was tired, not about shielding him from being exposed as having lost mental acuity. There's nothing in the story, again, there's so many things on the story about his doctors. There's nothing in the story about how could he not have been tested for Parkinson's. They say, well, he didn't test for Parkinson's. How could they not? When anyone who's got a relative that has Parkinson's looked at him and said, seems like he's got Parkinson's. Okay. So here's the paragraph. They run through the concerns some foreign leaders had about his mental acuity and his state of mind on some international travel. Taken together, these factors affected how Mr. Biden was scheduled and took a toll on his energy levels as he campaigned, people close to him said. So again, they're back to he just got tired because he worked so hard. He remained focused and in command in internal meetings, aides said. Okay. How can you write that sentence? It's just not true. It just sometimes, yes, he was in command and focused, but anyway. But according to some, they also took to telling one another when it was a, quote, bad day, meaning that Mr. Biden's mood led to some meetings or calls being reshuffled to a better time. Other officials said it was because Mr. Biden was busy. The whole thing infuriates me, just really does. Okay. In other news, Ohio Senate race.
Okay, let's look at some comments from Kip. He's not happy with the news media. Ever notice how the news media prefaces incendiary remarks with some say, as if they're some wise oriental sage, besmirching folks without warrant? Some say Carter Page is this, some say Donald Trump is evil, some say MAGA voters need deprogramming. They always quote the same dude. It's not a liberal media tick, it is a human tick. Because it's just easier to say, some say. Right? I'm sure you do it. I do it. Donald Trump does this all the time. Republicans do it. Conservatives do it. Liberals do it. Because if you were to be more specific, right, that's much more demanding. People tend to take the easy way out instead of directly attributing something. It's just easier to say, some say. So, yeah, usually it is sloppy journalism. And I remember when the Jewish Journal ran a cover story on me in 2007. More than any other story they published, to the best of my knowledge, right? They relied on anonymous sources because they needed anonymous sources to deliver the criticisms that they wanted to deliver towards me. They couldn't get people on the record to say them, and so they just would rely on anonymous sources. So it's often a tell when news organizations break their protocols because they so want to go after somebody. On the other hand, I was at Sinai Temple on a Friday night after that news story dropped, and someone who I thought I was on friendly terms with stood up during a discussion with Rob Eshman, who is the editor of the Jewish Journal, an incredibly charming and gracious man of the left, but just an admirable person in so many ways, just excellent social skills, someone who's been kind to me, who's always gracious with me when I interact, who just such a lovely person. I feel like a clumsy clod up to Rob Eshman. But there we were after services at Sinai Temple at an event called Friday Night Live, and Rob Eshman was taking questions from the audience, and someone who I thought I was on good terms with said, how could you publish a cover story on such a disreputable character as Luke Ford? Like, why would you waste your space discussing him? And I'm like standing there in the audience as Rob Eshman is trying to make the case for why I was worthy of a cover story. And the journalist who wrote about me, Brad Greenberg, he says he got tremendous pushback from other journalists who said, like, how would you dare dignify him with a story? It's best just to ignore this guy. He is beneath our contempt. So on the one hand, I look at the story and think, oh, they were heavily reliant on anonymous sources to trash me. On the other hand, they got tremendous pushback from their peers. Like, why would you even dignify this blogger with any attention at all? And then I had to deal with people in my Orthodox Jewish community. They said, well, what's your reaction to the story? And I was screwed because I couldn't complain about it because then I looked like a whiner. And I couldn't simply say it was fine because then I looked like a horrible person. So I would say it's fine if I didn't want to invest any energy in my response. If I wanted to invest a little energy, I'd say what I just said. That if I accept it as an accurate portrayal, I'm saying I'm a horrible person. If I criticize or complain about it, then I sound like a whiner.
On the eastern side of the Jordan, won't speak about himself as being Aver Hayarden. Aver Hayarden, if you're staying on the eastern side, is the land on the western side. So I want to thank, and by the way, if you look at Ibn Ezra, he says, he gives 4 more examples of psukim that he believes are written by post-Mosaic prophets. I thank David, who called my attention to the fact that Shadal, for the followers of Satmar, I mean, the Litvisher Rabbanim, who were very opposed to Zionism, those that were very.
So let's wash our souls in the well springs of Torah. This is Professor Marc Shapiro's 7th video on Rabbi Samuel Mohilever, a Russian Zionist rabbi at the end of the 19th century.
Opposed. Chaim Soloveitchik and others didn't speak of the 3 Shavuot for the simple reason that everything was being done. They were buying land, and it wasn't being done in opposition to anyone. They weren't going up to conquer the land. What these Lithuanian rabbis focused on was the fact that Zionism, in their eyes, was to create a new religion, not a Torah religion, but a secular type of Judaism. Okay, but Rav Mohilever mentions the Gimel Shavuos, the 3 Shavuot. Now, in religious Zionism, anyone who studies this will know there's all sorts of explanations as to why the Gimel Shavuot don't apply. Well, first of all, it's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not mentioned in the Rambam, it's an Agadic statement. In 1948 and before 1948, everything was done with the approval of the governments that controlled the land, and you go on and on with all the reasons why the Gimel Shavuos, the 3 Shavuos, don't apply. Some have said that they depend on each other. So clearly, after the Holocaust, you can't say that the non-Jews fulfilled their part of the bargain not to oppress the Jews too much. So that's. And if you had a religious Zionist education at a high level, you probably were taught that this position is nonsense. No one's ever held this. And yet the fact is, it's not nonsense. There have been people, although it's not halacha, I mean, assuming it's not halacha, it's not the Rambam, it's not a Shulchan Aruch. Not everything that Jews do is halacha. There's a lot of values we have that are not legal.
So one way of understanding Orthodox Judaism is, and defining an Orthodox Jew, is that he accepts the Shulchan Aruch, which was a 4-volume compendium of Jewish law, which was published, I believe, in the 15th century. There's a saying that common sense is the fifth volume of the Shulchan Aruch.
Pure halacha. We have Masorah, we have all sorts of things.
So a distinguishing characteristic of Orthodox Judaism is halakha, Jewish law, but Orthodox Judaism cannot be boiled down to simply Jewish law.
Hashkafic ideas that are not.
So hashkafa means outlook, ideology.
I can't show you a place, an actual halacha, but they're very important. And I have to say this, but it's maybe some of the religious Zionists may be upset, but the truth is that this idea of not going up, the 3 oaths, was taken very seriously by many figures throughout Jewish history, that is, Rabbanim. And they saw it as...
So there used to be these big debates between rabbis and Christian clergy in Spain in the 13th century, and Nachmanides, who was a different rabbi from Maimonides. So Nachmanides, he was much more of a mystic than Moshe ben Maimon. He argued in one debate with a Jewish apostate who became a Christian priest. He argued that when you look at Jewish texts, you can divide it into halakha, law, and agata, story, and only the law is binding. Now, that's not fully accurate, but it was a pretty useful debating tactic.
Something binding. Now, true, by the time you get to the 20th century, it's for almost all of them, it's no longer relevant because the governments have agreed, the Turkish and the British. However, the idea that this is just an agadic statement, you don't need to take it seriously, that is not historically true. Many people took it very seriously, the 3 oaths, and that's why Rav Mohilever feels the need to stress that what we're doing is not in violation of the oaths. In fact, let me share with you something here.
Okay, so this lecture awakened me to something that I was dimly aware of, but didn't realize how deep Wikipedia had an entry on this topic, and that is the anti-Semitic, the anti-Jewish component of some of Zionism.
Really, until today. First of all, he stresses anti-Semitism, that's the reason why we need the land. He doesn't speak about messianic things like Rav Kook and, Rav Kook's whole idea that God is returning us to history. We were living this half existence in the Golas for 1900 years, 1850 years. Now God has signaled to us it's time to return to the land of Israel, and this is going to be the beginning of redemption. For Rav Mohilever, it's much more practical, and he mentions anti-Semitism, but what about the non-religious? He says as follows, because we already saw this was an issue. He says that the land as a whole, in a communal sense, has to be run al pi halacha, in accordance with Jewish law. And this is really, as Salmon points out, his formulation here is really where you get the notion of religious Zionism.
So if Israel was run on a halakhic basis, on the basis of Jewish religious law, most Israelis would not be happy with that, right? Jews, whenever they've had the opportunity and the freedom, have left Orthodox Judaism.
Israel, Am Yisrael, Al Pi Torah Yisrael. That is the land of Israel for the people of Israel in accordance with the Torah of Israel. And Rav Mohilever, although he doesn't use that slogan, he expresses the exact same idea that you need all 3 of these. However, Rav Mohilever also says, and this I think is quite important, he says, we are not interested in enforcing anashim, pratim, yechidim, b'hanagatam. That is, we're not interested in private citizens. We want Eretz Yisrael, in a communal sense, to be run al pi halacha.
Okay, Kip has a couple of comments that I wanted to discuss. Kip says, America wanted to be a shining city on a hill. So one thing that non-Americans are shocked about when they learn about America, when they move to America, is how patriotic and how mystical and how intensely visionary many Americans' feelings about America are. So this notion of America as this shining city on the hill, that that came from the Puritans. And so Americans tend to be much more emotional and demonstrative about the flag and about their patriotism when compared to non-Americans. But here's Kip's comment in full. America wanted to be a shining city on a hill, but this conflicted with a Jewish desire for a multi-culti utopia. Now he wants to return to the land of Israel, not kosher. Okay, so there's no connection between the number of Jews in a land and how multicultural it is. All right, very few Jews in Northern Europe or Germany, and yet these are incredibly woke multicultural regimes. So if you don't like how multicultural the West has become, that's not to do primarily with Jews, right? Jews are just a tiny portion in the West. It's primarily to do with the choices and the preferences of your fellow non-Jews. So some of the wokest countries are the countries of Northern Europe, where there are only a tiny number of Jews. And the Puritans did have a disproportionate effect on the mythology regarding the United States, but most people are not content with the Puritan vision. Most people do not want to live like Puritans. What state will Joe Biden retire in? I expect his home state of Delaware. Would he not?
Say that the settlements should be run up halacha. If an individual privately in his home is not observant, that's not our concern. And here I think you see a distinction between the...
One of the wise parts of Judaism is the recognition of the tremendous difference between public and private. And so, yes, if you run public life according to Jewish law, but you don't intrude into people's homes, that's going to go down a lot easier. So there's a very big difference between if breaking the Sabbath publicly, right? You go out and you publicly break the Sabbath, you are separating yourself from the Orthodox Jewish community. If you privately break the Sabbath and nobody knows, you are not separating yourself from the community.
The Haredi approach and what became the religious Zionist approach. The Mizrahi, from the beginning, always said that in the land, in the state of Israel, and before that, in pre-state times, in a communal sense, we want marriage and divorce to be run by halacha. We want public transportation, these sort of things to be run halacha. But if someone privately takes his car and drives to the beach, we're not interested in going into people's private lives. And you could say, well, this is just abandoning halacha, but that was never the approach of Mizrahi. And Mohilever already at the beginning sets this out. There's an article by a man named Arkin, and he calls attention to interesting differences between Mohilever and Herzl. I'll just mention a few of them. So one of the things he mentions is that one of the early figures in Chovei Tzion comes to Mohilever and he asks him, what's the difference between you and Herzl? And he points out that I don't know if you know this. One of the points of Herzl's argumentation was that the non-Jews should support Zionism because they don't like Jews, and there's anti-Semites. The anti-Semites should support Zionism. I was looking for some things online, and I found a very detailed Wikipedia article here. Herzl's Michel and Zionist anti-Semitism, and it talks about. It's a very long Wikipedia. I don't know who put this together. The idea that the non-Jews don't like Jews, but there's two types of anti-Semites. There's dignified anti-Semites, and then there's really evil anti-Semites. Herzl's whole approach was we can work with the dignified anti-Semites.
So it's really good to have a visceral excitement for healthy things. And one of the things that listening to Marc Shapiro does for me, one of the things that reading his books and his blog posts do for me, is that I get a visceral desire to learn Torah. Right? He makes Torah just come alive. I just get consumed by excitement over learning Torah when I listen to Marc Shapiro. And I had no idea about this long Wikipedia entry, Zionist anti-Semitism. Right? This is where people who don't like Jews express support for Zionism in the state of Israel. And this is often done explicitly for anti-Jewish reasoning. Right, so this has been most notable among Christian Zionists. Right, they may be outspoken in the support for Jewish sovereignty in Israel due to their interpretation of Christian teachings about eschatology, the time of the end. Many people who identify with the political far right in Europe and the United States may support the Zionist movement because they wish to rid their country of Jews, and they see Zionism as the least complicated method, right? A lot easier than ethnic cleansing or genocide. So they get to achieve their goal. They get to satisfy their racial anti-Jewish attitudes. And Zionists have often cooperated with people who hated Jews and wanted to rid their country of Jews. There's a documentary called The Apartment, where this bloke in Israel explores his grandparents' apartment after they die, and he finds out that they were friends with a prominent Nazi. Back in the 1930s, they helped to arrange a deal between the Nazis and Zionists, whereby Jews in Germany could move to Palestine with all their possessions, with all their wealth. Right? The German Nazi government, prior to the onset of World War II, which made this operation then impractical, were doing everything they could to encourage Jews to leave Germany and to move to Palestine. So even the Nazis were quite pro-Zionist in the 1930s. So the Israeli government's collaboration with anti-Jewish politicians abroad is often criticized by anti-Zionists as a manifestation of Zionist anti-Semitism. It seeks to highlight Jewish hatred to provide further incentives for Jews to move to Israel. So anti-Zionists criticize Zionists' complicity with or capitulation to anti-Jewish attitudes as it gained traction in the 19th century. And there are many anti-Zionists who categorize Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. So Zionism means Jews have a right or even an obligation to return to Zion, their historical homeland. It's another expression of Jewish nationalism. So this is Wikipedia talking about a complex matrix of racial stereotypes. So in the late 19th century, people tended to see the world through biological racial terms, influenced by Darwinian notions of survival of the fittest. So you had all these different racial perspectives on the part of Europeans with regard to the Jews in the late 19th century, expecting that there were physical traits that would mark out Jews from other people. They had ideas that Jews had darker skins, larger noses, and were prone to certain disease or to limping and the like, and that they were rootless and a corrupting presence within Western societies. So you had the Jewish question in the 19th century about whether or not Jews were worthy of citizenship. How could Jews be considered citizens when their observance of the Sabbath and the kosher laws made it next to impossible to integrate them into the armed forces? Then you had enormous waves of millions of Jews leaving Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, which in part were triggered by pogroms throughout Eastern Europe, but also by a desire just for a better life. And during this time, according to Wikipedia, you had intensified prejudices in societies where Jewish communities were well established and assimilated, and it led to the internalization of these putative Jewish characteristics and Jewish self-representation. So how Jews see the world, experience the world, is affected by how the non-Jews around them see the world and experience the world. Jews in Western Europe, by and large, had a great deal of respect for the non-Jews around them, while Jews from Eastern Europe had hundreds and hundreds of years of history of living with intense antagonism towards non-Jews because non-Jews had intense antagonism towards them. So often Jews of Western European origins, especially German, and you see this embodied in Paul Gottfried, would often have negative stereotypes of Jews from Eastern Europe who tended to be much more radical in their politics. So Jews from Eastern Europe tended to be more radical in their Zionism or in their communism, or whatever their politics was. It was usually far more out of the mainstream than Jews from Western Europe, who tend to be much more moderate in their politics. And that is still true today. Most Jews in the United States are from Eastern Europe. And so most Jews in the United States are more left-wing than right-wing. Jews of Western European origins tend to be much more in the political center. So you have various scholars who talk about historic links between Zionism and anti-Jewish attitudes. And Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, shared with those who hated Jews one basic aim: the negation of Jewish life in the diaspora, the negation of Jewish life outside of Israel. So by mid-1895, Theodor Herzl thought that anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, right? And the most anti-Semitic countries would be our staunchest allies because they will prompt the outflow of Jews from Europe into Palestine and eventually a Jewish state. So often early Zionists took on negative perspectives of Jews in Europe, and they would contrast this image they would have of the Yid and a negative caricature of the European Jew with what the Jew could be if he moves to Palestine. And they would often use the same sort of language as anti-Semites. So Zev Jabotinsky, who developed revisionist Zionism in the 20th century, he wrote, "Our starting point is to take the typical Yid of today and to imagine his diametrical opposite, because the Yid today, meaning in Europe, is ugly, sickly, and lacks decorum. We shall endow the ideal image of the Hebrew with masculine beauty. So the European Yid, he speaks Yiddish, or we're going to move to Palestine, we're going to speak Hebrew. The Yid is trodden upon, easily frightened, and therefore the Hebrew ought to be proud and independent. The Yid is despised, and therefore the Hebrew ought to charm. The Yid has accepted submission, and therefore the Hebrew ought to learn to command. The Yid wants to conceal his identity from strangers, and therefore the Hebrew should look the world straight in the eye and declare, I am a Hebrew." So anti-Jewish attitudes and pro-Zionist attitudes have never been mutually exclusive. Advocates for a Jewish state will often enlist stereotypes of Jews, wittingly or not, to further the cause of Zionism. And Theodor Herzl appealed to European non-Jewish leaders that Zionism would resolve the Jewish question by sending Jews out of their countries to their own state. So the writings of Theodor Herzl, Max Nordau, and other European journalists were filled with descriptions of European Jews as parasites, as social diseases, as germs, and as aliens. And these views flowed logically from many of Zionism's basic assumptions about Jews. So Zionists accepted the 19th century view that anti-Semitism and racial difference was a permanent feature of human nature. So it was pointless to struggle against it. Jews have often been hostile to Zionism because the movement called for a retreat from the struggle against anti-Semitism. So many anti-Semites favor a Jewish state as a means of reducing the number of Jews in their midst. Right? There was an anti-Jewish activist, Wilhelm Marr, a German journalist, who coined the term anti-Semitism as he's an early example of a pro-Zionist anti-Semite. He supported Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine, and he claimed this is beneficial both for German Jews and for German anti-Semites. So the first anti-Zionists in the 19th century were Orthodox Jews who believed that Zionism was a heretical ideology. They argued that the return of Jews to the land of Israel and the establishment of a state there would only occur after the Messiah came, and Jews must accept living in diaspora, meaning living outside of the land of Israel, and must defer to non-Jewish rulers while waiting for redemption. So the Zionists were usually secular. They despised the passivity of Orthodox Jews, right? They despised them with such passion, they were often referred to as anti-Semites by Orthodox anti-Zionists. In 1918, Hungarian anti-Zionist Rabbi Baruch Meir Klein, president of the New York Board of Rabbis, said that the Goyim in America let us be Jews. They do not ruin our Talmud Torah. They do not reform our schools. They do not ridicule Jews who go to the mikveh and observe Jewish law. It is enough for me to be in the diaspora with the Goyim. I have no need to be in Eretz Israel. All right, I have no desire to be ruled in Eretz Israel by Jews who are anti-Semitic Zionists.
The ones who don't want Jews around, but they're not bloodthirsty kind of anti-Semites. So you go to them and you explain to them, that we know that Jews create problems for you. They're very successful and it creates all this tension. So how about you support us taking all these Jews out of your land? We'll be happy.
And let's go back to Kip's commentary. Jews have a tendency to invert the status quo. Really? Most Jews are not political activists. So it would be more accurate to say that highly educated people who feel that they deserve more importance than they do are incentivized to subvert the status quo. You see the same patterns that you are decrying among non-Jewish intellectuals. Jews are always trying to invert the status quo towards debauchery. Well, there's a large segment of Jewry, in particular Orthodox Jews, who tend to be virgins when they still marry, who are much more likely to be virgins when they marry, much less likely to engage in debauchery than your average non-Jew. So it would be more accurate to say that the high IQ, highly educated want more freedom to engage with sexual experimentation than those who settle down, get married, and perhaps are not as highly educated. So it's a lot easier to blame your problems on Jews instead of looking at your own people as the cause, the primary cause of the dysfunction that you decry.
Because now we'll have them all in the land of Israel, and you'll be happy because you won't have any Jews anymore. Herzl actually believed this, and I guess it makes a sort of sense in a sort of crazy way.
Okay, Bell says, Luke, quit avoiding the question. How do I deal with the loss of friends and lovers who have died? I occasionally get sad, and occasionally I will write about them and talk about them, but I don't think I've ever experienced it as crippling. I don't think that I've never taken to bed for days on end because of sadness. Right? I experienced the loss. It's particularly intense when I first experienced the loss, and the intensity of the loss diminishes over time.
He says that Herzl explains that the Jews, there's revolutionary things among the young Jews, and it creates all sorts of problems, and therefore you should help us establish our nation, country. And Rabbi Mohilever's perspective is different. He says he thought this was very dangerous to try to tell people, to try to raise the issue that Jews could be problems for your country and help us. So Mohilever was completely opposed and removed himself entirely from Miderach HaTamua Shel Herzl, from this propaganda approach of Herzl. And what did he do? Mohilever thought the approach is that we should just speak in terms of, we'll purchase land, and that the kings and the princes of the world should look kindly upon the Jews, that sort of thing. Not the anti-Semitic approach. Let's put it this way. Erkin gives other examples of differences between Mohilever and Herzl, although Mohilever admired Herzl and vice versa. But Herzl thought, and he writes, that the new homeland is going to be like Switzerland. Everyone would speak their own language. You got different cantons. Herzl couldn't imagine a situation where everyone's going to speak one new language, Hebrew, which wasn't even...
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that has been said to me that had the emotional impact of Dennis Prager saying to me, it's good to know that if something happened to me, that you'll be there to carry on the fight for good values. It's like, wow, it was just filled me up inside. And now I realize he's probably said that to countless numbers of people. It's an incredibly powerful thing to say to someone.
Even a spoken language. He thought that people would come from all over, and like in Switzerland, you have different languages. People would settle in different areas. And Mohilever thought that Hebrew, he believed in a revival of spoken Hebrew. Of course, it's just a dream, but everything's a dream. Settling the land, bringing Jews from all over the world is a dream. Of course, when Mohilever thinks about Hebrew, he's speaking Ashkenazic Hebrew, speaking that way. And you can speak Hebrew Ashkenazic. I don't know if Eliezer ben Yehuda, I can't recall now if he ever spoke Ashkenazic. I think early on he spoke Sephardic because he thought that would work best. But we know that people spoke Ashkenazic Hebrew when they taught Hebrew in the Tarbut schools, let's say in Vilna before the war. They taught them Ashkenazic. They didn't teach them Sephardic. I just was reading something about Ramosha. Who was it? So with regard to the Langer dispute, so I'm reading up on it now when there's a visit where Shazar comes to Ramosha Feinstein to try to make some sort of peace. And Ramosha speaks, and he can understand and speak in Ashkenazic Hebrew. So they spoke a little Ashkenazic Hebrew before they moved into Yiddish. But Mohilever was involved with the new school in Yafo that had Hebrew as its language of instruction. And I'm certain that at the end of the 19th century, this would have been Ashkenazic Hebrew. Look, Bialik's Hebrew is Ashkenazic Hebrew. His poetry is Ashkenazic. You can see from where the stresses are. So there's no reason to think in the late 19th century that it wouldn't be Ashkenazic. Why not? But it's, as we know, it became mostly Sephardic. Not entirely Sephardic. Because there's a few things in the language that...
Okay, so the Langer dispute refers to some children who were ruled mamzarim, or bastards. And then there are all sorts of restrictions. So normally Orthodox rabbis don't delve deeply into someone's background before they marry the person, because the more you delve, the more likely you are to find something that is going to blow up somebody's life. So there were these children who were ruled mamzarim, who were ruled to be bastards in Jewish law, and therefore they couldn't marry a Jew, and normal life was essentially would be denied them, particularly in the Jewish state. And the chief rabbi at that time, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rav Goren, he took matters into his own hand. He formed a Jewish law court that reversed the rulings of a past law court, and he said that these are not mamzerim, so that they would have the opportunity to a normal life. And so this effectively ended Rav Goren's happy, respected life. Right? Other Orthodox Jews and Orthodox rabbis shunned him, and so he lost his respected position in Orthodox Jewish life because of this controversial ruling. So the intense in-group identity and experience of living in Orthodox Judaism strongly militates taking any unpopular position. And Rav Goren just experienced such a severe backlash that he was pushed to the margins. And Rav Goren was among the most innovative and brave Ashkenazi chief rabbis we've ever seen in the land of Israel.
So, for instance, well, we know even in pronunciation, kamatz and patach, but there's a couple things where they adopted Ashkenazi, even Segel, by the way, and Seirei, they also adopted the Sephardic. It escapes me now, but there's a few things that in the pronunciation that they adopted the Ashkenazic. And as you know, we've spoken about this before in Hatikva. It's not Hatikva, it's Hatikva. That's actually Ashkenazic as well, with the pronunciation. Herzl wanted...
So people like Kip, it's just way too tempting to blame America's problems on Jews. He says, my people are too trusting. Yeah, he would have contempt for any other group that used this line of arguing. Like if women said, oh, my problem is I'm just too trusting with men, and then they take advantage of me. We're not ethnocentric and tribal enough. Well, there's no evidence that Jews are any more ethnocentric or tribal compared to other groups in America. Assuming good character was our mistake. Well, you'd ridicule that if anyone else employed it, but you'll employ it with Jews. So if a Jew tells you to go suck off a dog, then I guess you're helpless because a Jew told you, and you were just helpless before the verbal brilliance of a Jew. So what can you do? So you despise non-Jews to an incredible degree, that you think that if a Jew comes along and tells them to do something, they are just too naive and too weak to question it. Now, I don't share your loathing of your fellow non-Jews, and I don't share your need to blame America's problems on some tiny little group. Right? I recognize that non-Jews, just like Jews, have agency. Right? In your mind, non-Jews have no agency. That any time some smart-talking Jew comes along, your people are absolutely helpless. Well, I have a higher, more elevated perspective on your people than you do. I mean, you must absolutely loathe them for being this pathetic. People love to blame their problems on out-groups. It's just intoxicating. And it's emotionally satisfying, but it diminishes your ability to ascertain reality. It's a cheap cope, Kip.
Complete separation of synagogue and state. He said that the place of the rabbis is the synagogue, just like the place of the army is in the barracks. And we don't bring the army out into the street. They remain in the barracks because it's not a military dictatorship. So too, the place of the rabbis is in the synagogue, and they shouldn't be involved in public life. Rav Mohilever believed that the Torah, of course, needs to be the basis of communal life and law. And you can't just put the Torah in the synagogues. No, the Torah has to influence the nation as a whole. And finally, Erkin points to the fact that Herzl was willing to establish the Jewish state anywhere in the world. The preference was the land of Israel, but if you couldn't get that, somewhere else. And Rav Mohilever only focused on Eretz Yisrael. And
Right. So Jewish prayers are in the collective, and Jewish prayers and Jewish law continually refer back to the concrete land of Israel. So Judaism is not primarily some ethereal spiritual predisposition. It is a concrete people. It's a concrete religion for a concrete people that is written for execution in a particular piece of land, the land of Israel.
Anything else would have been unimaginable to him. But, really, the issue wasn't really raised before that other places in a realistic sense. Unless you think Argentina as an example. But no, I'm thinking Uganda, which really happens after Mohilever, but Mohilever stress was only in Eretz Yisrael.
Okay, let's leave it there. There's a great football going on. Los Angeles Rams with a 1-point lead.